All right, I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Mike Sterla. I co-chair the Basic Ed Funding Commission along with Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill. For everyone's information, this meeting is being recorded and streamlined live. So please silence your phones or we're going to turn the cameras on you and shame you. Before I begin, I'm going to ask Vicki to take the roll call.
Here.
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 Miller. Here. Phillips-Hill.
Here.
Rockman. Dwyer.
Here.
Sterla.
Here.
Topper. Here. Warner. Williams. Here.
All right, thank you. I'd like to recognize that in the audience, Representative Smith Waddell has joined us also, as well as two school board candidates that I saw, Karina Rios and Dr. Molly Henderson. And we've been joined by Senator Rothman now. Senator Phillips-Hill, do you have any opening comments?
Wow, lovely technology that you have here in this room. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Sterla. Appreciate you hosting us in your district in Lancaster, and thank you, of course, to the School District of Lancaster for providing this facility for our hearing today. And really appreciate all of those who are here to testify and to be part of this process. Just a brief thought, seeing that we have gone over our allotted time at each hearing in our first week of hearings, I would respectfully ask that today's testifiers summarize their written testimony so that we can maximize member participation during the question and answer period. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much.
Thanks. Took the words out of my mouth because we've run about an hour and a half late on every one of the hearings. That's okay because we're getting good feedback. But the more we can be succinct and get to the point, you can forego the thanking everybody for allowing you to testify and all that kind of stuff because you're here, you're testifying. So I'll bring up the first panel. If I could bring up the first panel, I'll get you sworn in, and then because of the way we're speaking at the podium, it's going to be one person at a time. But could I get David Lapp and Marc Stier to come forward? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, indicate by saying I do. David, you can.
Am I now on? Great. I'm here from Research for Action. We're an education research organization based out of here in Pennsylvania, out of Philadelphia. I direct RFA's PACER project. It stands for the Pennsylvania Clearinghouse for Education and Research. And our task is to try and summarize education research and conduct original analysis to better understand how our system of public education is working here in Philadelphia under current policy. I've been a teacher, I've been an education attorney, and as a policy researcher, I've been studying this for over 20 years. And I'm also a parent of 3 children who have attended Philadelphia public schools. I won't thank you for this opportunity because I'm instructed not to, but no, I am very honored to be here. If nothing else, I hope you take away 3 things from my speaking today. One is that Pennsylvania, the defining feature of our system in Pennsylvania is inequity. It's what sets Pennsylvania apart from other states in the nation in a bad way. And in many ways, it's an upside-down system that works the opposite of how it should. We see nation-leading inequity in virtually every metric that we look at in Pennsylvania. We see it in school funding, we see gaps in terms of access to educational opportunity, and we see gaps in our achievement data as well. Second, I hope you find that you take away that in order to eliminate inequity, we must identify adequacy targets for schools. It's impossible to eliminate inequity without identifying school funding adequacy. And third, I hope you take away that Pennsylvania schools work well when they are equitably and adequately funded. Large parts of our system have been neglected and need repair, but we see excellent schools across Pennsylvania that are adequately funded. The challenge before you is not to abandon this system, but rather to make sure that it works for all students in all communities. So inequity is what distinguishes Pennsylvania. Virtually every metric tells the same story. Pennsylvania boasts average or slightly above average achievement, either in funding, in opportunity, and in overall achievement. But those averages are masked by nation-leading inequity. Gaps in funding, gaps in opportunity, and gaps in achievement. There are gaps in most states, but the size of the gaps in Pennsylvania are national outliers. They're not normal, and they're not acceptable. This commission's charge is to recommend a constitutional system of school funding. So let's start with what the research has found regarding school funding in Pennsylvania. Study after study, again, the same conclusion. Nationally, Pennsylvania ranks average or above, but near the bottom in terms of funding equity. Most states have progressive school funding systems, where high poverty schools receive more funding than low poverty schools, but not Pennsylvania. Baker, DeCarlo, Weber ranked Pennsylvania 11th in the nation on overall spending, but they found severe inequality, severely unequal system, with districts serving high child poverty spending barely 80% of what districts with low poverty. They ranked Pennsylvania 44th in terms of school funding progressivity. They also documented profound disparities by race. Similar findings were found by the Urban Institute and by the Education Law Center in New Jersey, which graded Pennsylvania an A on total funding, but graded Pennsylvania an F, a failing grade on funding distribution. Adequate and equitable funding matters because it leads to adequate and equitable opportunity. And the opposite, the lack of funding, leads to the lack of opportunity. We've been studying how to measure school inputs. What do these funding mean as far as what students actually receive in schools? We created, using the federal civil rights data collection, the Education Opportunity Dashboard, which ranks the 50 states based on access to 14 indicators of educational opportunity. In domains of access to quality educators, access to quality school climate, and access to a college and career-ready curriculum. We found Pennsylvania opportunities mirror what we see in funding. High overall average opportunity, Pennsylvania ranks 17th, but nation-leading gaps. Pennsylvania ranks 50th in the nation in terms of the gap between what's offered to students of color and what's offered to white students in our schools. We rank both by race and income, and Pennsylvania, the gaps on 12 of our 14 indicators are significantly larger than they are nationwide. Students of color have less access to certified teachers, less access to certified STEM teachers, experienced teachers, a low student-teacher ratio, less access to schools with low suspension rates, low student absenteeism, less access to schools with advanced math, AP and dual enrollment courses, calculus courses, chemistry courses, physics courses. We're not even measuring whether or not the students are actually getting in those roles, enrolled in those students, whether they're even attending schools that offer those opportunities. It's the first threshold of opportunity, and that's where we see nation-leading gaps for Pennsylvania. We also break this down by individual race, and we see, again, the 49th, 50th, and 49th ranked in the nation for both the black-white, Hispanic-white gap and the gap between students eligible and not eligible for free reduced lunch. And this isn't just attributable to poverty. We broke down high poverty, mid poverty, and low poverty schools, and even within our high poverty schools, we see the nation's largest gap between what black students and white students are receiving in terms of educational opportunity. In other words, if you're a black student in Pennsylvania, you attend a high poverty school, you're less likely to have those opportunities than if you're a white student who attends high poverty schools. Again, this is the opposite of what it should be. It's an upside-down system. The Department of Education recently found that students in low-wealth districts, particularly students of color, are nearly twice as likely to be taught by inexperienced teachers and by out-of-field teachers, teachers who are not trained in the grade or the subject that they're teaching. Dr. Ed Fuller from Penn State recently found large disparities in both teacher vacancies and in teacher attrition rates by student race and teacher race. We've been studying teacher staffing disparities by funding adequacy. Using the calculations from Dr. Matt Kelly from Penn State, we compared the number of teachers per 1,000 students that students receive in adequately funded schools compared to inadequately funded schools, schools with high shortfalls. And we found that adequately funded schools provide their students 11 more teachers per 1,000 students than in the schools with inadequately funded districts. This is true also of administrators. It's true also of professional support staff. We also found that the inadequately funded schools pay less than the adequately funded schools. And they serve those students with the most needs. More students in poverty, more students with disabilities, more students receiving the English language learning students. It's important to acknowledge that that represents a massive resource gap. We calculated that for all the inadequately funded schools to just match what adequately funded schools received, it would take 11,000 more teachers, 1,000 more administrators, and 1,600 more additional professional support staff, and it would cost $2.6 billion just in salaries, again, just to match what adequately funded school districts provide their students. That's not counting benefits, it's not counting a whole slew of other costs that go along with that, but that's just to match salaries. I'll skip this section here, but there's a litany of other inequities that we have documented in the research with regard to segregation, with regard to facilities, with regard to access to out-of-school and after-school time, pre-K access, and with regard to educator diversity. We've spent a lot of time at RFA studying educator diversity, finding that Pennsylvania has one of the largest gaps between our student and our teacher race demographics. Again, outlier ratio in there, and it's getting worse. We have almost half of our schools have only white teachers in Pennsylvania. 600,000 students attend schools that only employ white teachers currently. All of that is related to funding because our educators of color are located in our most inadequately funded school districts that have lower salaries, fewer teachers, and serve the most needy students. Of course, they have higher attrition rates in those schools because it's a harder job. Briefly, we see the same thing with regard to achievement gaps. I've provided some data there showing that our NAEP scores, the gap between our Black and Hispanic students and our white students, again, is among the largest in the country. And the same thing is true with graduation rates. Again, Pennsylvania, same story. Better than overall or average overall graduation rates, but larger gaps. So what does all this leave us? Such clear evidence of educational inequity in funding, in opportunity, and in outcomes being the defining characteristic of Pennsylvania, the question must be, how do we fix this? How do we know how to achieve equity? We must define and calculate adequacy targets to do so. Adequacy and equity are two sides of the same coin. They're inextricably linked. You cannot know if every school has equitable funding unless you know if they have what they need. The formulas you passed in 2014 and 16 were a great step along the way. The adoption of student weights and district characteristics is aligned with the research evidence. It's what the quality states that are adequately funding their schools are doing. So this moment provides an opportunity for the Commission to finish what it started. By refining the formula to adopt adequacy targets and allocating resources proportionally to districts with the largest shortfalls, we can achieve school funding fairness. The compelling successful schools model presented by Dr. Matt Kelly would be a wise approach for the Commission to adopt. This model, if this were enacted into state law and used to progressively distribute state resources to districts with the most significant adequacy gaps, we would make pivotal progress toward equitable opportunity and ultimately narrow achievement gaps. So finally, I'll just reiterate that this system is one that's invaluable and deserving of preservation. We've witnessed successful, adequately funded schools across Pennsylvania, and the path before us is clear. We must address inequities in our system, beginning with equitable and adequate school funding. I caution the Commission from losing focus from this path. Recent proposals for vouchers and diverting revenues to private schools pose significant risks to our commitment to educational equity. We've seen this in other states. The research on vouchers has not been favorable. We reviewed Pennsylvania's voucher districts and found that they are among the most underfunded, They struggle to provide adequate numbers of teachers, to pay their teachers well, and they serve the students with the greatest needs. Those are the districts that need your support. We already have a lot of policies that are inefficient in how we distribute our funding. The cyber charter system is creating a huge fiscal impact, negative fiscal impact on school districts, as are the perverse incentives in our special education funding for all charter schools. Before we create new systems, we should upend our upside-down system and fix existing inefficiencies and meet our constitutional mandate to provide equitable and adequate school funding for all public schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Marc Stier, and then we'll take questions for the panel. And if I could, I would encourage you to make sure you talk into the microphone as opposed to necessarily even the members here, because that way the audience can hear. Thanks.
Now it's on? Okay, cool. Representative Sturla, Chairman Senator Phillips-Hill, members of the Commission. As you know, I've written much in the past about inequity in our schools, and I'll have an op-ed coming out about the importance of adequacy and equity targets coming out of this commission very soon. So I'm not going to repeat that, particularly since I knew David Lapp was going to speak out of me, and he shared his testimony with me. So I'm going to do something a little different. I want to take a step back from the immediate question and think a little bit with you about why funding public education is so important. Now, you might think the answer to this question is unnecessary. We have a constitution that mandates that we have a thorough and efficient system of education. There's enormous public support for it, as we'll show when we release a poll in a couple of weeks. But I think sometimes it's useful to step back and think about some basic things that we all assume are obvious. First of all, you know, sometimes the arguments and evidence for something need to be refreshed. Maybe what we all think about the importance of public education isn't true. So why don't we look at some of the new evidence for it? And second, as we think about how to repair a system, we really need to focus on why it's so important. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to do that by looking back at an old text. You know, I started my career, my work career as a professor teaching political philosophy. So I have a bias towards old texts. Sometimes because when you look at what someone said when they were creating an institution that didn't exist, like our public school system, yeah, they have to deal with things that we take for granted now. But when Thaddeus Stevens helped create the public school system in Pennsylvania, when he was the great educator in the Pennsylvania legislature before he became the great liberator in the United States Senate, he explained quite clearly why public education is so important. So I want to go back to his 1835 speech against the repeal of a common school law that had been a law he proposed and that had led to the creation of state-funded public schools in the Commonwealth. He said then, if an elective republic is to endure for any great length of time, every elector, by which he meant voter, must have sufficient information not only to accumulate wealth and take care of his pecuniary concerns, but to direct wisely the legislature, the ambassadors, and the executive of the nation. Here and elsewhere in his speech, Stevens presented the ideas that public education is critical to our democracy and to our prosperity, that one can find repeated in the debates that led to the creation of the public education clause in our Constitution in the late 19th century, and in the debates that led to the revision of that provision in the 1960s. Many of those who spoke about the necessity of the education clause in the Constitution mentioned the importance of educating good citizens so they could play a vital role in our republic, and others spoke about the critical importance of education in creating economic prosperity, not just for those who receive a public education, but for everyone. I want to point out that Stevens was arguing against legislators who proposed to repeal the free common school law and replaced it with a subsidy for the poor to attend private schools. Our current debates are not new. This has been going on for a long time. Stevens would not accept that as an alternative because he didn't believe it would ensure that everyone got a decent and adequate education. He did note that many people were not happy with the common school law because they thought that schools were that they paid their tax money for was for the benefit of others and not themselves. But he insisted to those seeking the repeal of the free common school law that reducing their taxes would not benefit them, for the schools are for their own benefit. The public schools of New England were his model. He said, in New England, free schools plant the seeds and desires of knowledge in every mind without regard to the wealth of the parent or the texture of the pupil's garments. When the seed, thus universally sown, happens to fall on fertile soil, it springs up and is fostered by a generous public until it produces its glorious fruit. It is not uncommon, he went on to say, to see the poor man's son, thus encouraged by wise legislation, far outstrip and bear off the laurels from the less industrious heirs of wealth. Some of the ablest men of the present and past days never could have been educated except for that benevolent system. That's why adequate and adequately funded public schools are important. Not because fairness requires it, but because we all benefit from well-funded schools. The Republican Party of Stevenson and Horace Mann in Massachusetts, who was also a Republican, as you know, were founded in opposition to slavery. Its opposition to slavery was rooted in the idea that not only do all human beings have inalienable rights, but that the greatest resource of any community is the natural talents and abilities of its people. Freeing people from the bondage of serfdom when we created the United States and did away with the European rules and principles was the first critical step to enabling political communities to take advantage of those talents and abilities. Ensuring that young people have an education that lets them develop those talents and abilities to the fullest was the second critical step. By taking both steps, we created the most prosperous country in the world, as well as one with the most vibrant democracy. Now, I'm going to take a little jump from the late 19th century and just summarize some contemporary evidence, because in addition to being a teacher of political philosophy, I work a lot with numbers. And I've been looking at the research on the question that Stevens raised and the points he made about the importance of education for democracy and the importance of it for prosperity. There's a lot more research about the prosperity aspect of it now, but I'll just say that the evidence that shows that the higher educated population a country has, the more likely it is to have a vibrant democracy. The more likely it is for people to take part in politics. The more likely it is for people to vote. The more likely it is for people to talk to their friends about politics and read newspapers. Education is critical to preserving our democracy. The evidence also shows that it's critical to our prosperity. We've seen, for example, in cross-national studies, there's enormous evidence that both how much education people have and the quality of that education, measured by standardized tests and other things, are closely related to wages and prosperity and economic growth. Indeed, there's research about the history of our country that shows it wasn't just our natural resources, it wasn't just our broad free market that created our prosperity. The consensus of scholars is that between 1/5 and 1/3 of the economic growth in the United States in the 19th coming into the 20th century was the result of our early and profound commitment to public education. There's also research that looks at the relationship between education attainment levels and economic success of the 50 states. One recent study showed that the high wage and thus high prosperity states are those with a well-educated workforce. Sadly, Pennsylvania falls just about in the middle of those 50 states. We could be doing a lot better. In fact, there's some research that suggests if states like Pennsylvania were to attain the education levels of success in the best educated states in the country, that is Minnesota and Massachusetts, our gross domestic product and our state gross product could be 50% higher in a generation or two if we attain those levels. That's an enormous benefit. Similarly, there's evidence that shows that spending more on education leads to higher wages and leads to job creation. A recent study shows that a 10% increase in education spending results in adults at age 40 having 7% higher wages and a 3% reduction in the likelihood of being poor. Most strikingly, that study also shows that the wage gap between low and middle income students and high income students is narrowed. Funding education to help low and middle income students doesn't hurt the people at the top, it actually benefits them as well. While extrapolating these results to the economy is difficult, I made some back-of-the-envelope calculations that $1 billion per year in new education spending could lead to a 2.2% average increase in Pennsylvania wages, a reduction of the poverty rate of 1.1 percentage points, and an increase in the state gross product of about $900 million, with the generation of 12,000 jobs for Pennsylvanians. And that doesn't include the multiplier effect of this spending. There are a lot of footnotes in my remarks. I'll share that information with you. But the tendency of all this research is pretty much the same. Strong schools, highly educated population, both measured in how long they go to school and in the quality of their education, is critical to economic growth. It's critical to wages. It's critical to the future of our economy. And it's also critical to our democracy. Now, public education is costly. As Stevens recognized, self-interest understood narrowly would lead us to skimp on public education so as to reduce our taxes. But that would be a short-sighted policy, one that the Republicans of Stevens' day, who represented the business community as they do now, rejected. I'm trying to be as bipartisan as I can, so I'm only quoting. In fact, most of the research I cited, half the research I cited was from people who I know are political conservatives. They've done, the data is the data. There are no alternative facts when it comes to education. Education benefits our economy. What Stevens defended was what Alexis de Tocqueville called self-interest rightly understood. That is self-interest that doesn't just look at our immediate economic benefits, but our long-term economic benefits. Self-interest rightly understood today would tell us that we need to invest in education. We need to fairly fund education, not just to benefit those with low incomes, not just to benefit Black people and Hispanic people who are among those, as David's research shows, most profoundly affected by the inequity in our school system. It's not just about them, although it is about them. It is a matter of fairness. But it's about us, too, because the world needs a highly educated population more than ever right now. It doesn't need everyone to go to college. We know that. But it needs people with post-secondary training. And if you don't have good primary education, secondary education, you can't take advantage of that post-secondary education. We always talk about the enormous benefit the GI Bill of Rights brought to this country in terms of powering the economic growth and the growth of the middle class in the second half of the 20th century. The GI Bill would not have worked if we didn't have great primary and secondary education in this country, because there wouldn't have been the people prepared to take advantage of college education or apprenticeship programs today or workforce development programs today. One of the great things I've seen in the last couple of months is that the legislature, Democrats and Republicans, are agreed about workforce training. I think the Senate budget added a little bit more to the House budget. That's great. That's the kind of education that is critical to us. But it has to be prepared by a really strong foundation of adequate and equitable education in our primary and secondary schools. So with that, I'll stop and see if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A tiny bit of housekeeping before we get to, we've been joined by Senator Miller, and I'm told that the people online are having a hard time hearing, so make sure that you really speak into the microphones. If you two can come back up for questions, we'll ask you both questions at the same time. So we'll start with Representative Ortizai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lapp, I have a question for you. On page 10 of your written testimony, and I believe you mentioned this in your written remarks too, I'll read what you have here and then I'll have a question. It says, by refining the existing formulas to incorporate adequacy targets and subsequently allocate resources proportionally to districts with the largest shortfalls, we can achieve school funding fairness. Now, our commission is tasked with redoing the formula, looking at it. Can you kind of expand and elaborate how we could refine the existing formula or create a new formula to address what you're suggesting in that statement?
I'm suggesting you don't need to necessarily create a new formula, that you have a very strong formula. There are always ways to refine it. I'm not going to be able to speak to the intricacies of that right now, but the point is that by having adequacy targets, that the formula can be used to identify adequacy targets, as Dr. Kelly did in his work prior to that. And what you can then do is say, okay, these are the adequacy targets, and the districts that have the biggest gaps, that's where the majority, they proportionally get more of the money. So the distribution would be different. I guess in that sense, it would be a different formula in how you're using the formula to distribute the funding.
So you would take the adequacy number. I'm just trying to get to specific recommendations and ideas, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm
right.
just, for our own purposes, as we go back into session to try to figure out, all right, what are we going to do?
Yes.
Having you in front of us and giving us like specific recommendations on what to tweak here and what to look at there. You're saying go through, would you say Dr. Kelly's spreadsheet? I think he gave it to us at the hearing he was at, and that was over in Allentown, right? And say, okay, these are the schools we should start with first and focus on those.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right. And I think the level up system that you currently have is a model for doing that, to direct the primary amount of the funding toward the districts with the greatest gaps as defined by those targets.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Isaacson.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your testimony. I just want to follow up on something that, where we left off in Philadelphia with regard, we were talking counselors, but I want to direct it now towards teachers since you, Mr. Lapp, brought it up in your testimony with regard to the level of teachers that are available, and the teachers that are educating our children. And we all know that we are suffering from a teacher shortage. I believe the Department of Education has had to do historic numbers of emergency certs to be issued to help us get teachers into our schools. And when we were talking about trauma last week, we had a discussion about the amount of counselors per students or families. How do we put this as part of a formula, this teacher issue, with regard to making sure that there is not only the proper amount of teachers per student, because I think that that's an inequity that we have, the teacher-to-student ratios that are existing, but also how do we get and attract the diversity of teachers that are needed in the classrooms.
It's a big question.
We have a big job ahead of us.
Absolutely. And I think it's the right question. I mean, as far as like, these are, we know within schools that the teacher in front of the students has the biggest impact on what happens in those classrooms and student educational progress. As far as the formula goes, as far as using that with formulas, there are models that do that are based on input type of models for directing funds. The concern about models like that is that, of course, every school district is different, and basically the people that understand the best of what their school districts and their students and their teachers need and their schools need are people there locally making those decisions that have the inside knowledge. So by prescripting, this is the number of teachers you should have and in every particular school, in every classroom, that doesn't allow for that recognition of nuance in different schools. I would recommend models that, the current funding formula, that provides the resources and then empowers local decision makers to figure out what's the best, to determine the best use and allocation of those resources, whether it's counselors or teachers, whether it's that balance between how many teachers do we get and how much do we pay them? Because that's the trade-off that we see in this data, that we see that some schools, and we looked at that, we looked at some schools that was like, they're prioritizing more teachers, but they're paying them less. And others are prioritizing paying their teachers more, but they can't afford as many for that reason. So it's a balance there. But my recommendation would be to follow a model that really empowers local decision making in figuring out what's the best use of those resources. As far as attracting teachers is concerned, I mean, I think you have a little bit of a, if you build it, they will come kind of a situation going on here where, the job is difficult. It's a very difficult job and it's not paid well. And so if we make the job easier and we pay and reward teachers and recognize them as professionals, that will be the biggest step we can do in attracting additional teachers and quality educators into the future.
Okay, just 1 second follow-up. And I understand what you're saying with regard to each school district having their own ideas of what they want accessible, as kind of a local control issue. But I guess what we need to think about is how do we put the equity of access in school districts that are historically not getting it, because that was the gist of your testimony. Like, where's the STEM in the school district with minority students in it? And how do we, and that's something I'm thinking, that was the point I was trying to make with the balance, to make sure that everyone has access to an equitable education. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Senator Rothman.
Turn on. This is a beautiful facility and beautiful campus. So thank you for hosting us, and I had no idea how beautiful Lancaster School District's campus was. So a couple questions. First, I don't know, is it Dr. Lapp or Mr. Lapp? David?
Yep.
I only make my children call me Senator, so you can call me Greg. I'm a product of public education. I have 5 children. 3 have already graduated from public schools. I have 1 in and 1 getting ready to go. I can tell you the names of most every one of my teachers from my 13 years at Cumberland Valley High School. My mother was a school teacher in the city of Harrisburg schools, as a matter of fact. And I'm curious, I've sort of had my own radical shift about local control and even local taxes in funding of education. Are there school districts, this isn't a trick question, but are there school districts that are spending more than adequately? So in other words, there is something to be said about equity, and if I have the advantage because I take money and spend it to get tutoring for my children, does my daughter have an advantage over a child maybe in another school district who doesn't have opportunity? The chairman, good chairman, referenced an art class going on a trip to Paris as opposed to a school not even having art supplies or an art teacher. Is that something, and this, again, it's not a trick question, are there school districts that are spending more than they should be and over-adequate on things that maybe they shouldn't be? And I wasn't talking about Lancaster in that case, I'm just, but I mean, I'm thinking about equity and thinking, right, there has to be people that are overspending or doing more than they should be doing or more than necessary. Have you found any of that?
So there's 2 sort of things, 2 parts there. Do districts spend more than what is adequate? Yes, absolutely. Is it more than they should, which is another thing? I don't know that that's true. I think when we think of adequacy, I think it's important to sort of think of, we're not talking about the Cadillac version, right? We're talking about the basic, the Prius, right? Like what will get us there. It might not be the most fancy thing. Yeah, there are districts that are, they're providing their students more than that. And good for them. If from my perspective,
but it's not. I mean, this isn't a zero-sum
absolutely.
game.
And to your point, I agree.
School districts are competing for teachers. So is it fair that one school district is paying more than a neighboring school district? Is it fair that one school district has more money to spend on facilities and beautiful facilities when other schools still have asbestos and lead-based paint? I mean, so we're talking about the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This commission has kind of come up with a formula on how to distribute the funds equitable.
Absolutely.
Someone's going to have to pay, right?
Absolutely. I don't disagree with you, Senator. I think you're absolutely right that the more that wealthy districts spend, the greater the inequity is. And
no matter how much more money we put into a budget, even if we put another $6 billion, you're still going to have that issue, right? I mean, you're still going to have.
Well, not if you're targeting it specifically to the districts that are underfunded. I don't think you should be adding additional money to those districts that have already adequate amounts.
Okay.
Your focus of your funding should be targeted to the districts that are underfunded, not to districts that already have adequate funding.
So to that point, and I haven't seen. You mentioned about where we rank as a state. The study just came out that we're top 5 in teachers' starting salary, salary after 10 years, benefits. I mean, we spend 35% of a teacher's salary going into the pension fund. Not that that goes directly to the teachers working now, but that's got to be number one in the country. Like, where can we're in the top 10 in total amount when you include the local share. Where can we improve so that it is equitable? Because we're not here to talk about necessarily just spending more money. We want to spend the money correctly.
Absolutely. So there's a lot in that. I mean, I think the salary issue. You put your finger on the competitiveness issue, right? Where if you have a district here that's spending this much, and it's tough to compete with teachers. So that the goal here is to bring these up to make this more competitive. And yes, overall we might be spending a lot, but again, that's masking the fact that we're spending way too little in some districts. And so the goal here, I don't think you're going to have a lot of success cutting from those districts that are spending a lot. That's a pretty tough policy angle to pursue. But the goal where you can, is you can provide more resources to those districts that are under.
Question for, it is Dr. Stier, right?
Marc's right.
And thank you. Chairman, just one more quick question. I just want to make it clear, too, because there's a lot of discussion about the benefit of public education, as if there's those who don't believe in that. I mean, I think it's universal, and I'm glad you talked about Thaddeus Stevens. He's one of my absolute heroes in public policy. I will correct you, though, he never served as a United States Senator. He was a state representative from Adams County, and then he was a congressman from Lancaster County. So, but on his deathbed in 1868, he was being interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter asked him about his great accomplishments. And this is a guy who introduced the first anti-slavery law, forced Lincoln to do the 14th Amendment, introduced the first version of the 13th Amendment. And he said it was that 1935 law that he defended in Pennsylvania. But I ask everybody this when we talk about Thaddeus Stevens. What do you think Thaddeus Stevens would be saying now about what we've done to the education of black and brown students when it comes to the disparity in results? This is a 200-year experiment that the city of Harrisburg School District is less than 50% graduation rate and spends 50% more money than suburban schools.
Right.
What would Thaddeus Stevens say about this?
I think he would say we're doing something wrong.
Yeah,
And
me
we
too.
need to figure out, but I think when he looked at the funding data and that David presented, that I presented, and other forums, he'd say, well, we're not spending equitably. I think he would acknowledge, as I think we all acknowledge, money is not the sole solution. The kinds of things that money has to be spent on is good teachers primarily, and guidance counselors, nurses, things that make the education environment work for our kids. But if we don't have the money to do those things, then we won't have equitable schools. And we have to put the money in those places that most need it, as I think you've been suggesting. And that means the school districts which have less of a resource base, and the school districts would also teach kids that need more support, precisely because of poverty and other barriers to their getting ahead. We have a lot to overcome in our country. We put a great burden on our schools because there's a lot to overcome in terms of just the social
But we
inequity.
still spend more than any other country in the world, and we still are the greatest country in the world. But thank you for your time, your testimony.
Thank you. Senator Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for you, Mr. Lapp. I often talk about needing more caring adults in the building, and your testimony on page 7 started to put a cost on what that means, and you talked about the 11,000 additional teachers, the 1,000 additional administrators, 1,600 support staff, at a cost of $2.6 billion. In your oral testimony, you talked about that the number didn't include benefits, but also, can you talk a little bit about that parity doesn't mean equity, that getting to equal is not where we should be?
Equity, of course, doesn't mean equality. It means that everybody has what they need. That it's fairness. And we know that when schools serve high numbers of students in poverty, high numbers of students with disabilities, English language learners, students in homelessness, students in foster care, that this costs additional resources to properly serve. The research is very clear on that. So equity means that we're providing what those schools need. And that may be that they need more. It does mean that they need more than schools that don't serve those students with those needs.
Yeah, so that those numbers actually could go up for those
Absolutely.
under-resourced
That
schools,
is
both in
just-
terms of bodies and the cost.
Correct.
Okay,
correct.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill.
There you go. Well, Mr. Lapp, Dr. Stier, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Lapp, I want to point out something in your testimony because I think it is the first time that this commission has heard this sort of sentiment so articulately stated in the last few weeks that we have been taking testimony. And you said, Pennsylvania ranks on the higher side of overall school funding, but ranks near the bottom in terms of school funding equity. So we're hearing over and over and over again, you know, we're at the bottom overall in school funding. We need to have more money, debates about how much money. But you said we have an A on the total amount of funding. Dr. Stier said money is not the sole solution. We have an F on the equity of funding. So along those lines, and you've been asked this question, but I still don't feel like you've really given us the answer that we need as we look to construct this formula and make our recommendation, and that is, what changes to that basic education funding formula would you suggest to improve our rank in terms of school funding? You said we don't need a new formula, but the distribution should be different, and it needs to be refined. How do we do that?
We start by prioritizing funding to the districts with the greatest needs. And by not.
And what are those needs? When we are looking at making the prioritization of those funds to those districts with the greatest need,
Right.
how do you define need?
By calculating adequacy. So
And
using
how do you
data.
calculate
Right,
adequacy?
so
Like,
the-
we're continuing
right,
to
no,
talk
so
in a circle.
the approach
So
that you
what
saw.
are those factors? How do
Right.
we define it? What are the measures?
Yeah. So the model that you were presented by Dr. Kelly is a terrific model. And it's called the Successful Schools Model. You look at what do schools that are spending, that are achieving high rates spending. And you calculate a base cost of what it is that they're spending. And then you use the weights that you already have in your formula, which are consistent with research which has been found around the nation, to adjust that to adjust how much each district gets based on the needs from those additional things. And then based on where you accept that gives you a target. And then that target becomes the basis for how you distribute your money, your resources. You don't send resources to districts that have adequate funding. You send resources prioritized toward districts that have less than funding. So that model that he spoke very clearly about, I think, is really an excellent one. There are others, but they all come out, and I mean, every one that's been done with Pennsylvania shows the same sort of disparities, and you're gonna end up with that's why you have to have adequacy targets, because that's how you get to equity, is to know. You can't know who to send those dollars to until you've identified those adequacy targets.
So we're going to have to manage this to assure that what we're doing reaches those targets and that we have accountability for those dollars. Because we don't want to just send those resources. We want those resources to make the difference that needs to be made for these students, correct?
Absolutely.
So how do we measure that? And the reason I ask that is my predecessor in the Senate used to love to say, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So how do we measure that once we do it?
How do we measure efficient use of resources?
Right. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think the inputs that there are so many more inputs that we would love to be able to measure. There are things, you've talked already that about the lack of inputs or lack of data around things like facilities. But we have a lot of very useful inputs. The measure of how many teachers we're getting per student is a really useful input, as addition to counselors and other support staff and administrators. Those that's telling you where they're using their money, where they're using their resources in those regards. I think that we have waste. That is absolutely an issue. But I think that I would not suggest you get too bogged down in that problem, because you're not even there yet. If you're attaining adequacy targets, then you can know, look, this district is at adequacy, and we're not seeing results. We're not seeing inputs that we've measured this way. But you got to get there first before you can focus on that.
And thank you for that. If I could, so Dr. Stier, you referenced Dr. Kelly's testimony. Mr. Lapp referenced his testimony. We heard from him last week, and both of you utilized his data in your testimony here today. So again, we are tasked with looking at the formula to make recommendations to the formula. We're hearing a lot about additional dollars, and when everyone talks about those additional dollars, they continue to cite Dr. Kelly. So in his testimony last week, he stated we need $6.2 billion to close the gap. When he testified before the Commonwealth Court, it was $4.6 billion. In February of this year, Dr. Stier, you indicated when you were discussing education issues with ABC 27 that we need $4 billion additional dollars. Yet here today, you're testifying that money is not the sole solution. I just want to point out that to everyone that for us, this is incredibly difficult, and I feel like we have this continuous moving target. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but we're trying to grapple with that as well. So again, I think in my mind, it's helpful to take it back to the formula and make those determinations.
So let me first address the issue about moving targets. I think, as Professor Kelly said, one of the main differences between what he said today and what he said in the courts is, first of all, he's including things like special education, which were not included in his previous testimony. So it's really it's not that he's changed the number. He's expanded the level, the areas of funding in which we need. And I think that's the right thing to do, because I think special education is very important, and also is very burdensome for our schools. Second thing, there's just a change in, 18 months, particularly this last 18 months, there's been some inflation, so that adjusts the targets as well. I would suggest, and I would also say, education tends to have faster inflation than other areas, because it's highly labor intensive, and you can't. Barber can't, we have productivity, we can produce computers faster. A barber can't cut your hair much faster than they could 30 years ago. A teacher can't teach kids much faster than it's labor intensive, and labor costs go up faster than other things. So I don't think, I would focus not on the exact number at this point. I think because it's not just the overall number you have to think about, you also have to think about the state share. $6 billion would not be the whole state share. Local districts in some places need to come up with more money, where they're taxing themselves less than the average in the state. But I would work start with what Dr. Kelly said, figure out what the state share should be with those numbers, and then when you look at the formula, you need more money in the formula, but also some tweaks in the formula that make sure that money gets to the least well-funded districts by our adequacy targets. And formulas can be changed in lots of different ways, in subtle ways, big ways. Keep the eyes on the prize, which is adequacy, and then adjust the formula to get to adequacy as quickly as possible. Could I say something about
to summarize it succinct, just start with formula, work on formula, and then everything else will kind of come in behind.
Start with the targets.
Start with your
Start with the targets. figure out how much money we need in different schools, and then tweak the formula. You have two then variables: how much money you put in and how quickly, and how you tweak the formula. And I would put as much money in as quickly as possible, tweak the formula as quickly as possible to get the money to the places that really need it.
Thank you very much. And it clearly sounds like they're having much more fun
They
next
are.
door than we are. So
I understand they're having a competition to see whether they can drown us out, but,
they're winning. Thank you very much.
Senator Miller.
Thank you very much. And David, quick question for you. I served on the Allentown School Board. I lived the realities of underfunding, and these school districts were an 80% minority school district, 75% at or below the poverty line. One thing that I really want to focus on is facilities and the inequities. I know Representative Przywara and I have talked numerous times on this during this commission, but your thoughts on how crucial addressing facilities in that adequacy target, in that same conversation, just overall thoughts on that.
So I have children that come in through Philadelphia Public Schools, and they've gone to schools that are really state-of-the-art and beautiful, and then they've gone to schools that are in dire need of their crumbling buildings and really tough situations. And it is difficult as a parent to send your child to those schools. And you know, there's all kinds of safety issues that come up with that. It is a glaring issue that needs to be addressed. I think it is a separate issue from the basic ed funding formula. You have you know, the PlanCon system, and you have the maintenance improvement grant system that was adopted just a few years ago. Those are actually good systems. The problem is that we're not funding them.
Right.
You know, I did include there some reference to some research that we've done that's documented that those are systems that are pretty consistent with what other states do. The difference is that we're not actually funding them. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a huge issue. The other thing that I'll flag is that we don't have good data on this. We don't collect. The only things we collect are there's mandated inspections around asbestos and lead. Actually, lead isn't even mandated, but if you do study it, you have to report it. But that's it. And there's so much other safety issues around school facilities that we're not documenting. That we don't, you know, some districts like Philadelphia have done their own studies and have this data, but we don't have anything that allows us to compare schools and districts across the Commonwealth in their facilities needs at a uniform level. So data collection's a big issue.
Yeah, and it's same thing of like the target, having that goal, what to move towards, and decades, or I mean now years for PlanCon, but being underfunded. We've got a number of school buildings, you know, 149 years old, Harrison Morton Middle School in Allentown, and we just recently opened Haase Elementary, which we saw a big decrease in charter school students enrollment. So when you're talking about being a parent that's deciding, you know, facility that has air conditioning or doesn't, the inequities are enormous. So I appreciate your testimony on that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Topper?
Thank you. Mr. Lapp, when it comes to access for programming, which you brought up, which is something that I've been trying to wrestle with in terms of the formula. So are we, because a lot of that is in local control too. Now, I'm not necessarily saying it should be. I think I'm becoming more and more of an advocate for the Department of Education or the General Assembly coming up with a little more base curriculum. Is that, so when we talk about what is being offered to students from a curriculum or programmatic standpoint, is that something that we need to make as a standard? So in other words, if you attend a public school in Pennsylvania, you will have access to these courses. Do we as a state now need to step in and lay that out, in your opinion, in terms of leveling a playing field for access to programming?
We do have that. It's just a matter of how granular you get with that. Like, we have very clear curriculum standards curriculum content standards that all schools are supposed to be covering in our in Chapter 4 of our regulations. But so the question is a matter of degree. You know, how prescriptive do you get?
What do you think?
I tend to think you should be trusting your local communities in that regard. I'm also not an expert in this area. I will be quite frank with you. It's not an issue I've studied extensively, but I do know, having talked with many administrators, that we put a lot of mandates on schools And that brings extra costs. And you know, I think that we have professionals in these buildings, and that we should be trusting them to be expert in how to serve their students. But we need to provide them the resources to do so.
Dr. Stier, anything you'd like to add to the programming and your research?
Sure. I mean, I agree some local control is very important, but look, the state has the responsibility for schools, and I think the state should set the broad outlines of a curriculum. If we want every child to get the right preparation to go on to, whether it's college or workforce training or apprenticeship or something, there's certain standards that they need to meet. And I think it's the responsibility of the General Assembly to set those standards in broad terms. How to deliver them, that I think that's up to local teachers.
Right, but I mean, with today's
agree it's your
technology,
Mm-hmm.
with today's technology, is there really a reason that if we have a physics teacher in one school district, that all school districts in that area shouldn't have access to that class in some way, somehow? So in other words, I hear the mandate thing all the time, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is what it is. Like you said, we're responsible for it. So it's ridiculous to assume that there's going to be this massive influx of state funding and not carry with it some of those standards. And to me, access to programs and curriculum has to be one of those standards. And I think if we're talking about adequacy for students, that baseline of understanding, what does that student need to learn by the time they graduate school? But then also to Senator Rothman's point, if you have a school that is offering a lot more opportunities, whether it be, pre-calc, physics, whatever, then we need to make sure that the students have access to that in some way, shape, or form, right? Because not every student is the same. So anything that you find in your research, even that you could get to us, I know that we are, in heavy research mode here. That's something that would be very informative to me, what other states are doing, anything that you could get us, because that is the baseline we're talking about. I understand the argument of, well, if you put more money into it, then school districts will be able to use that on everything. Well, what does everything mean? What are those programs that they need to be using it on to make our students' achievement gap lower as well? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could I just, yeah, I want to say I very much agree with you. I mean, equality for all means that basic programs that we think all children should have are available everywhere, and so that's part of your responsibility. And then I think the other part of your responsibility, to come back to something Senator Phillips-Hill said, is monitoring how things work. One of the things we know is we have good evidence that when we put more money into schools and set high standards for them, schools improve. That's been shown in other states. It actually was shown in Pennsylvania after the investments in education in the Rendell years. We took some steps back, but in the immediate years after that new funding during the Rendell administration, we found significant improvements in standardized test scores in Pennsylvania. And that's what they found elsewhere as well. So you have to do two things. You have to set the standards for what we should be teaching, and then you have to monitor at the end to see whether those standards are being met. And if not, ask some hard questions.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit more about the inequity factors. And I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, I have a school district that has, not now anymore, we've opened up a couple other ones, but at one point in time was the only school district that had a homeless shelter for an entire county of 500,000 people. And so we would identify 1,000 kids a year in our school district that were homeless at one point in time or other during that year. Every other of the other 15 school districts in the county had 0 homeless kids, because when they became homeless, they went to the homeless shelter and showed up at our school, which, great, but there's a cost involved with that. We had the highest percentage of kids with special ed needs because we had good special ed programs, but that meant we had to spend more money. We had the highest level of kids in poverty of any of the school districts. We had the highest level of kids with English as a second language because Lancaster County resettles refugees at a rate 30 times the national average. And so when you put all those kids into one school and you said, okay, you should educate them for the same cost as educating kids over here, that are not in poverty, that speak English, that don't have special education needs, and aren't homeless. And that's not equitable. And so I guess the thing that I would ask you to talk a little bit about, because there's a question about, I mean, I know Senator Rothman had a question about, like, okay, well, what about the districts that spend more than that? In one sense, good. I'm glad that they do, as long as it's on their own dime. Yes. Meanwhile, how do we get our kids to get to that adequacy level, the funding for that adequacy level? And when the question was, well, how do we measure that? In the determination of where adequacy comes from, it's my understanding that we looked at districts that had been measured as successful. So we had means to measure them as successful, which is what we then used as the model to say what's equitable. We can use that same metric to measure whether or not they're meeting success. Is that, I mean, is that correct, or?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Gee, okay. All right. Hey, well, that's my question then, because I'll try and get us back on time. So, yeah, thank you very much for your testimony. All right. A couple of quick housekeeping issues. While the next panel, if the next panel would just stand, I will. It's Laura Boyce, Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus. Kristen Haase, Senior Policy Fellow and SDOL teacher with Teach Plus. Dominque Botto is not here today because she has COVID. Brenda Morales from Power Interfaith, and Reverend Dr. Gregory Edwards, Chief of Staff of Power Interfaith. If you can stand, I'll get you sworn in. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, indicate by saying I do. Okay. Now, before we get to the first testifier, Laura Boyce, who can come up to the podium a while, we've been joined by Edie Gallagher and Maura McGran, who are both School District of Lancaster school board officials. And I want to put in one plug for, while everybody's in Lancaster here, Thaddeus Stevens' grave is in Lancaster here. His former home is in Lancaster here. And the Kleist Saloon, which he owned, which was next to his law office, is in town here. And when they were doing excavation for the convention center, they unearthed the cistern that was in the back of that saloon. It had been shut off from water supply and had actually been set up and was still in use the things were still there for its use as a place to harbor runaway slaves. So it's really some fun history that you can go see here in Lancaster. But Laura.
Thank you, Chairman Sterla, Chairwoman Phillips-Hill, and the Commission. I'm Laura Boyce, the Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus, which empowers teachers to take lead on key policy and practice issues that advance equity, opportunity, and student success. I'm a former teacher and principal. I'm also the parent of 2 sons who will attend Philadelphia Public Schools in a few short years. In my written testimony, I shared preliminary findings from a research project with students and parents across the state. Overwhelmingly, whether they are from urban, suburban, or rural districts, from wealthy or underfunded districts, parents and students have big dreams for the future. Students speak about pursuing passions, obtaining financial stability and generational wealth, and changing their communities. Parents dream of their children becoming independent, happy, psychologically strong, and fulfilled in their careers. There is also a shared expectation that public schools will be the vehicles that enable children to achieve their dreams and fulfill their full potential. Across geography, race, and class, there are more commonalities than differences in what parents and students want from public schools. But while sky-high aspirations, brilliance, talent, and potential are equally distributed across the Commonwealth, we know educational resources are not. As you heard from my colleagues, whether we focus on resources, inputs, or outcomes, Pennsylvania consistently is rated one of the most inequitable states in the country. You can draw a straight line from inequitable funding to inequitable learning opportunities to inequitable achievement outcomes. It's unfair and cynical to decry the underachievement of students in underfunded districts while at the same time refusing to give these districts the resources they need to hire enough qualified educators, update their facilities, expand pre-kindergarten, and provide equal opportunities to those in wealthier districts. And by the way, according to Dr. Kelly's analysis, Harrisburg is underfunded by over $10,000 per student when you take into account student need. Over the past 25 years, as Marc mentioned, dramatic improvements in student achievement on the NAEP coincided with the Rendell administration's prioritization of funding increases for education. Those gains began to be erased amid the devastating education funding cuts under Governor Corbett. The past provides us with a roadmap for the future. If we want to see improved student achievement, economic growth, a strong workforce, investing in adequate and equitable education for all Pennsylvania students is the best investment we as taxpayers can make. I would propose 4 criteria for success as a report card for this commission's work. First, the commission must set adequacy targets for all 500 districts. I know you've heard that before. Second, include resources for pre-K, special education, facilities, and transportation as part of those targets. Third, set targets for the state share of overall funding targets. And finally, create a plan with a reasonable timeline for the state to close its share of the adequacy gap. If this commission fails to meet any of the above criteria, it will have failed to meet its constitutional duty. This will not be easy. I've met most of you, though, and I believe in your commitment to Pennsylvania's students. I believe you ran for office not to do what's easy, but to do what's right and to strengthen our Commonwealth. As I prepared my testimony, I know I was not the only one, but I drew inspiration from Lancaster native Thaddeus Stevens. He's one of my heroes. My older son his middle name is Thaddeus, after Thaddeus Stevens. And in his famous speech that Marc quoted, but I have a few different lines, where he was defending the public education system from repeal, he said, "Pennsylvania's sons possess as high native talents as any other nation of ancient or modern time. Many of the poorest of her children possess as bright intellectual gems, if they were as highly polished, as did the scholars of Greece and Rome. But too long, too disgracefully long, has coward, trembling, procrastinating legislation permitted them to lie buried in dark, unfathomable caves. I trust that when we come to act on this question, we shall all take lofty ground, look beyond the narrow space which now circumscribes our visions, and so cast our votes that the blessing of education shall be conferred on every son, and I would add daughter, of Pennsylvania, shall be carried home to the poorest child, of the poorest inhabitant, of the meanest hut of your mountains, so that even he or she may be prepared to act well their part in this land of free men." The responsibility this commission faces is just as great, and many of the pressures on you are the same as those facing the General Assembly almost 200 years ago. The costs of fixing our unconstitutional system are great, but the costs of failing to educate our Commonwealth students, those gems in need of polishing, are far greater than the $6.3 billion more needed to create a Commonwealth where poor children have equal educational opportunities and our public schools truly serve as what Thaddeus Stevens called the great equalizer. This commission did not create our inadequate and inequitable system, but you have inherited it and now have a choice whether to perpetuate it or reform it. You have a unique opportunity and the power to not only be on the right side of history, but to shape history. The children of Pennsylvania are watching this commission, waiting for justice. Thank you for your commitment to all Pennsylvania's children.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Haase, and I teach English language development at Carter and McRae Elementary School in this district. I am also a senior policy fellow, and over the past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to bring my expertise to education policy discussions and to build relationships with legislators. As I shared in my written testimony, my firsthand experiences as a parent of a student in Manheim Township and a teacher in the school district of Lancaster have opened my eyes to the disparity in education funding between underfunded and affluent districts. The students and the staff of this district are capable, but they need resources, time, money, and personnel to be successful. We deserve a level playing field to compete, but it often feels that the deck is stacked against us. At this time, I'd like to share 4 findings from a Teach Plus report I contributed to based on focus groups with over 100 teachers across Pennsylvania to explore the real-life consequences of state underfunding. First, underfunding means outdated and sometimes unsafe school facilities that hinder learning. One of my colleagues spoke of the 108-year-old school where he teaches in Philadelphia being closed for asbestos exposure twice. The school community later learned that they had been exposed to asbestos for the previous 2 years. For the rest of their lives, they will have to live with the threat of cancer and other health consequences. In my district, we still have buildings without air conditioning. I remember assessing students' reading skills in a 96-degree classroom that felt like an oven. I remember the first graders were on the floor to stay cool. Some of them were asleep. I remember sweating through my clothes and feeling dehydrated after only a few moments. Imagine your child having to learn in those conditions on a regular basis. Second, underfunding means insufficient guidance counselors and other mental health staff at a time when student mental health is in crisis. One teacher in our focus group said, quote, "We lost almost all of our counselors in the 2013 budget cut layoffs and never got them all back. We have 5 for a school of 2,700 students. A couple of years ago, we had several suicides and attempted suicides and not enough professionals to help," end quote. Next, underfunding means we are unable to compete with wealthier districts to attract and retain great teachers. One teacher in our focus group said, quote, "We cannot compete with larger districts, county-wide systems, or areas that have more economic opportunities for new hires. Why would someone else choose our small, rural, financially strapped district when they can go somewhere else and be paid a decent wage?" End quote. Finally, underfunding means being unable to provide our students with equal academic opportunities and resources to those provided in wealthier neighboring communities, hindering student learning and achievement. With more resources, underfunded districts could update textbooks and other instructional materials, provide tutoring for any student who needed extra help to reach grade level, and offer more AP, dual enrollment, and CTE classes to help the students be college and career ready to compete in this global economy. As my predecessor said before, urgent action is needed to fix our state's unconstitutional funding system and ensure both adequacy and equity. To accomplish this goal, I urge the Commission to take the following actions. First, determine the total cost to meet the constitutional standard by establishing a meaningful adequacy target for each school district. Next, calculate funding targets that also address unmet needs beyond K-12 basic education funding, such as facilities, special education, and pre-K. Third, ensure that the state meets its constitutional obligation by establishing a fair and equitable state share for those targets so that low-wealth districts can reach adequate funding at a reasonable tax effort. Finally, create a plan with a reasonable timeline for the state to meet its share of those targets. By taking those 4 steps above, you will send my students and the students of underfunded districts across the state of Pennsylvania the same message my son receives every day. You matter, your future matters, your dreams matter, your education is important and worth investing in. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. I'll point out, we've been joined by Senator Vincent Hughes, And next up is Brenda Morales, who is going to read a statement from Dominque Botto, who is not here today because of COVID, and then she'll also do her own testimony.
Good morning, and thank you. Excuse me, I have Dominique's on my phone, and this is what she has to say. I first came across Power Interfaith when they came to my elementary school's PTO meeting. I was a parent first, but a paraprofessional working firsthand in the public school system. When I was told about the funding crisis and how certain districts had to go without because of their racial and economic demographic, it angered me. As a child who grew up in the public school system and who is now raising their own child in that same system, I thought, why should he go without because of his zip code? Why are teachers struggling and having to provide their own funding for their classrooms when I can go 10 minutes down the road and see already well-off families getting even more? Most importantly, I thought, what can I do to make a difference? We are here today to shed light on some of the struggles that I see my students and their families go through. Whether that's not having the proper transportation in the schools with children having to navigate and walk, all while making sure they are in school on time, not having adequate before and after school programs for those parents who work odd hours and can't make it to school by a certain time. I've had to walk or wait with many kids after school to ensure they got home safely. We live in a very diverse district. Lancaster City is home to many different nationalities and hues, and that's what makes our city so great. However, we want and need to be able to understand the language barriers so we can be accommodating to those new families that have chosen to call our city home. That means we need funding to be able to pay interpreters at school and in the community. These things will not pay for themselves, and I believe if we can properly pay qualified individuals for this role, they will do it. I work with a colleague who is Spanish-speaking who has expressed this concern. She is a building assistant who gets pulled from her duties to translate. Her pay should reflect that. I have another colleague who has to pull her phone out to use Google Translate to be able to try and communicate with her student, all while trying to lead a class of about 20 kindergartners. What was eye-opening to me during the summer program was the amount of families asked if they could have extra food. These are very hard times, and some people are just barely making it in our district. On the other end of the food spectrum, I'm concerned with our district lunches, as we give the same portions to a kindergartner as we do a fifth grader. Many of these kids are going hungry throughout the day, which directly affects their ability to learn and focus properly throughout the day. I can't help notice these richer districts have more options at hand. Why don't we? We will fight this fight until change comes. Thank you for your time. And even though you already heard me, my name is Brenda Morales. I am a leader with Power Interfaith and a retired school district of Lancaster educator. I taught English as a second language for 22 years in the district, and I thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of students and teachers. So why do we need a better funding formula, one that fully and fairly funds all schools? We don't have enough time for me to explain all the reasons I have, so I'll sprint through a few things that I would like to see change or improve. Facilities with appropriate temperature. You can't imagine how miserable it is to try to work in extreme heat or extreme cold. I used to keep a pile of sweatshirts in my classroom for days when the boiler wasn't working or the heating on one side of the building wasn't adequate, but there wasn't anything to do on super hot days. Student studies have found that extreme temperatures do affect a student and a teacher's ability to focus, and therefore affect learning. Class size. Imagine 30 third grade students. I co-taught in a class that size. Believe me, that's a lot of children. It's children with fewer chances to interact with their teacher, fewer chances to get help, and lower academic success as a result. Better lunches. My husband went to Reynolds Middle School back in the 1980s. He said the lunch was never enough. He was always hungry. For some kids, including my husband, school breakfast and lunch is the only reliable food they get. We need the lunches to taste better and be larger for the older students. Finally, English learners, or Ls as we call them. SDOL has nearly 2,000 Ls, or about 16% of the population. This is a challenging group to work with because of the diversity of their previous school experience and their life experiences. A migrant student from Guatemala is very different from a Congolese refugee or a student from Puerto Rico who had a good education there, but they're in the same class. Ls, especially beginners, need smaller classes. For several years, I had beginner classes of 14 or 15 students. Sometimes my ESL class was larger than the regular English class. It was extremely difficult to meet the needs of that many students. I know many people think that we already spend too much money and think we don't need an increase to our education budget. I would like to remind everyone of the $800 million budget cuts back in 2011, which have kind of been referenced already today. I remember colleagues finding out they were no longer employed. We lost nurses, librarians, Spanish teachers, PE teachers. Schools here in SDOL still share librarians and nurses. We have yet to make up for that deficit in funding. This is why we need full and fair funding, to ensure students in districts like the School District of Lancaster have the same advantages as students in rich suburban schools. And here's more from Thaddeus Stevens. As we know, he left money to create Stevens, what is now the College of Technology. His idea was to create a school for indigent orphans with no preference on race, religion, or ethnicity. And we know he spoke in defense of public education, saying it is a matter of public concern and a duty the government owes its citizens, and that this should be for all children, including the poorest child, so that everyone is prepared to take part as an educated citizen. I ask the members of the commission ensure these ideals continue and every child has access to the best possible education. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Edwards.
I will not be quoting Thaddeus Stevens for the record. Good morning, I'm Reverend Dr. Gregory James Edwards. I serve as pastor of Resurrected Life Community Church, United Church of Christ, in the city of Allentown. I hold the role of executive at the church's Community Development Corporation, RCDC, which provides high-quality early learning and school-age educational programs for infants, toddlers, preschoolers, students, and their families residing in Lehigh and Northampton counties. Moreover, I serve as the chief of staff for Power Interfaith, Pennsylvania's largest multiracial, multi-faith community organizing entity with over 200 congregations from the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Quaker, Baha'i, and ethical humanist traditions. We are people of moral courage, organizing and working to promote racial and economic justice on a livable planet, and have organized chapters in the Lehigh Valley, central Pennsylvania, as well as Philadelphia and the cities surrounding collar counties. For the past decade, we've been deeply committed to the cause of securing full and equitable funding for Pennsylvania's public schools. Research from several of our key leaders, including David Masankis, has been used as expert testimony to verify the inherent, appalling inequities that exist within our public schools. Inequities that persist because of the current allocation of funds sanctioned by the state's legislature. Multiple studies have shown that Pennsylvania's school districts have more significant racial and class achievement gaps in student learning than nearly any other state. As just one example, the race and class disparities exposed within the William Penn School District versus Pennsylvania Department of Commonwealth Court case demonstrates that the school districts receiving the most revenue in Pennsylvania are disproportionately white, while districts receiving the least revenue are disproportionately Black and Latinx. Moreover, 50% of all Black students and 40% of all Latinx students in the Commonwealth attend the most underfunded schools in Pennsylvania's lowest wealth districts. We have to face the facts. Whether because of neglect or malice, the state's legislature's failure to enact inequitable funding has and continues to perpetuate racial inequity across our Commonwealth. We are an outlier because of choices made by political decisions and policymakers. To be blunt, our political leaders have been holding the hopes, dreams, and future of scores of Pennsylvania's children hostage because of a lack of political will to do right by all of our children. I'm reminded of the words of Dr. King. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whether it affects one directly, it actually indirectly affects all. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structures of our reality. In other words, if one part of our human ecosystem is unwell, we are all negatively affected by that unwellness. Likewise, if all parts of our community are healthy and cared for, we are all able to thrive. What we choose to do or not do in this moment to address ongoing racial and structural inequities, inequalities perpetuated by a refusal to equitably fund Pennsylvania's public schools, will ultimately impact all of our state's children. Not just poor or black or brown children, all children. And therefore, it will inevitably impact all of our communities, regardless of our zip code, the color of our skin, our economies, and other situations. Creating an equitable Pennsylvania school system doesn't mean that white students lose because black and brown students win. It means all students have the resources they need to thrive, to be successful, and reach their full potential in learning, self-actualizing themselves and life. When we all win, we all win. Today, I make a confident plea on behalf of those united in a movement for educational justice. I speak not merely to your intellects, but to your hearts and to your commitment to justice. We call upon all elected members of the General Assembly, and in particular, the distinguished members of this commission, to take decisive action to fully fund Pennsylvania's public education system. As you have heard today, you have the support of the public and the mandate of a court case backing you up on this. The evidence is overwhelming. Pennsylvania's public schools face an immediate and unconstitutional crisis of racial, economic, and educational justice. The General Assembly holds the key to our children's future, and it is their moral duty to unlock the door of opportunity for every child in Pennsylvania, regardless of their zip code, family income, or skin color. We must have full funding for our public education system, period. It is not a choice, but a fundamental right currently being denied, an ongoing threat to our state's prosperity, reputation, and moral fabric. The basic education funding budget must be distributed equitably, bridging the gaps that have persisted for far too long. Only through fair public school funding can we resolve the inequities that have plagued our communities for decades. But it cannot end there. We implore you to develop a comprehensive solution to Pennsylvania's unconstitutional school funding system immediately. Our children are suffering while we are deliberating. Let us set a concrete timeline for compliance by the 2024-2025 school year. We cannot afford to allow the chronic underfunding of public schools in black, brown, and lower income neighborhoods to persist any longer. In closing, I offer my prayers and hopes for each of you, regardless of the letter behind your name. May you find the strength to face the challenges that lie ahead. May you find the courage to engage in the necessary but difficult conversations. Please be opening to listening and learning from the voices of those most affected by your choices and by these disparities. And above all, may you hold hope in your hearts, not just for your own children, but for all of Pennsylvania's children. Together, we can create a bright future for our beloved.
Thank you. Representative Isaacson.
Laura? Thank you for your testimony. I want to pick up where we kind of left off with the first testifiers with regard to equitable funding. And since you've been teacher or principal, you're now doing the advocacy on behalf of this, and we have this task. It was brought by the last panel to our attention that we do have a high level of funding for education, but it's not equitably distributed. So the question becomes, how do we equitably distribute it? Would it be dealing with the hold harmless provisions that we have constraints on, the amount of money that we do fund?
As I mentioned, maybe I can. There we go. I believe that the pathway is through the setting of adequacy targets. And so just to build on the previous panel, the connection between adequacy targets and our current formula is that the adequacy targets were developed based on the weights within our current formula, which take into account factors of student need that require additional resources based on research. So factors such as poverty, English language status, disability status, et cetera. And so if we use those weights and the successful school model to basically figure out what is the spending of the high-performing school districts on average, and then adjust that spending based on the weights of individual school districts to account for need, those targets are what we should be shooting for. Now, it's not the same thing as just running all the money through the formula, getting rid of hold harmless. It's essentially taking the weights from our current formula to set new targets and figuring out how we go from our current level to those targets. In some cases, there are districts that if you just think about how we're slicing up the pie with our current formula, you would say they're getting more than their fair share. But when you look at the adequacy targets, they're still inadequately funded. And so that gives us a base level for each district in terms of how much we need to send to each of those districts. So I don't think, I would discourage the commission from thinking just about, are we going to eliminate a hold harmless provision and redistribute the current pie? We need to use adequacy targets to figure out how much the pie needs to grow, and then pro rata accelerate funds to those districts that are furthest from adequacy. So those that are the furthest away are getting the larger amount, so that over a short amount of time, we're talking 3 to 5 years, not decades, they are getting to that level of adequacy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
I'm not sure who to address this to, but I've heard Mannheim and Lancaster, and I just wanted to point out, according to my numbers, the school district of Lancaster spends $25,262 per student, which is $10,000 more than the state average and $11,000 more than national average. And Mannheim spends $17,977. Are you saying that $25,000 per student is not adequate?
Are you speaking of Mannheim or Mannheim Township? They're two different.
The school district that you mentioned, Mannheim Township.
Mannheim Township.
You said it was 5 miles away, but yet they had better results. Yet they're spending a lot less. I think that's what your testimony said. Well, your son is a student.
My son is a student at Mannheim Township.
Yeah, you said that disparaging fundings across the school districts.
So, again, I think we were talking about the needs of the students of the school district of Lancaster differing from the needs necessarily of Mannheim Township. Something what I can speak to as an English language development teacher is we have 10 times the amount of English development students and teachers that Mannheim Township does. I'm just talking about more of a, their different needs for Mannheim Township. So Mannheim Township, has 4 athletic turf fields, for example. The school district of Lancaster is just building one right now.
But yet Mannheim's spending considerably less than Lancaster.
Yes, so Laura.
If it's okay for me to jump in,
Sure.
Senator, this gets back to what I was talking about before with adjusting that spending based on student need and based on those weights. And so I'm just looking at the numbers from Dr. Kelly's analysis, which again is using those adjusted weighted student counts that take into account English language learners, students living in poverty, students with disabilities, all of which Lancaster has a much higher proportion of. And when we look at those, we see a spending shortfall per student in the city of Lancaster of $4,600. We actually do see a shortfall for Manheim Township as well of over $3,000 per student.
You may not have been at the hearing in Allentown, but one of my school districts was on there, Cumberland Valley School District, which is maybe the most popular school district in the state.
I was in Allentown, I heard that.
Okay, and that says there's a shortfall there, and they only spend $15,000. They have over 30 different languages spoken in their elementary schools. So, you answered the question. It's still not enough. So, $30,000 a student.
That is based on the analysis that again is based on research and that the judge found credible. I would agree
Lancaster
that
should spend $30,000 a student.
I would agree that the current funding is not in line with what is needed to meet student needs, and I think that, as you've noted, the student achievement does bear that out. Now, are there districts like Cumberland Valley who are going to be outliers, who are still high performing despite lower levels of spending? There's always going to be outliers. We know that's the case, but the way that this model was constructed, the successful school model, takes those averages and looks at the overall picture as we look across the state. And, again, in the court case, it's already been established by the judge, the concept that money matters in education and that it's associated.
No. The way we spend it, not how much. The
I
way
would
it's
say both.
distributed.
I would say both, yes.
Yeah, we would disagree there. But a couple
that money
times I've
matters
heard.
in education?
I'm sorry?
You would disagree that money matters in education?
No, I would disagree that the court case says we need to spend more money. It says
I didn't say that. I said that the court case did establish that money matters in education.
That's right. The way we distribute it, not necessarily we need to spend more or less. But I've heard the asbestos, and this goes to my question about local control of facilities and facilities management. Sporting Hill Elementary removed their asbestos in 1976 when I was a student there. So the fact that we still have schools that have asbestos, is that the function of local control or not enough resources? I guess it's not enough resources, but
I would say not enough resources.
we also didn't have air conditioning, I'd like to point out, too.
Yes, well, I understand that times have changed in terms of our expectations around air conditioning, but the research
99% of schools in the world don't have air conditioning, by the way.
The research is very clear that
I'm just saying, we all benefit from it, but to talk about that is an issue, so.
I know that I cannot do my best work if I'm in an office without air conditioning, and I wouldn't want my children to be learning in an air-conditioned school building, which they will attend in Philadelphia in a few years. And so while some people do overcome these barriers, I wouldn't argue that our bar for what our students deserve is just, what is offered in other parts of the world, particularly, as you said, since we are aspiring to be the greatest country in the world.
We are the greatest country in the world. Thank you.
So shouldn't our standard be higher then?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Williams.
Sorry, Laura, can you come back up? I have a couple questions. The court said we needed to spend more money to get to adequacy, correct?
The judge said that Dr. Kelly's testimony was credible, that spending is associated with higher performance, and that our current system of funding is discriminatory towards students in low wealth districts.
Thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between educator shortages and our school funding shortages?
Yes. So my colleague David Lapp spoke to some extent to this. If you know me, you know that teacher shortages is one of my major passions. It's something that I'm very concerned about. Teach Plus has been very actively working on this. And it's true that educator shortages are a national trend, but Pennsylvania's teacher shortage crisis cannot be separated from our school funding adequacy and equity crisis. All districts in Pennsylvania are having a harder time recruiting and retaining teachers, but it's really underfunded districts that are bearing the brunt of this crisis and that have actually been experiencing shortages for many more years than it was in the headlines. And so just a few specific statistics. The lowest wealth districts in Pennsylvania have been found to employ less qualified teachers. than adequately funded districts. That's whether you look at novice teachers, out-of-field teachers, or emergency certified teachers. For example, compared to adequately funded districts, middle school students in districts with a very high per student shortfall are nearly twice as likely to be taught by a novice teacher with 3 or fewer years of experience. They're 40% more likely to be taught by an out-of-field teacher, and they're nearly 9 times more likely to be taught by an emergency certified teacher. And the research shows us that all of those less experienced teachers or less qualified teachers are less effective in terms of student outcomes. There's higher rates of teacher attrition than in high wealth districts. There's fewer classroom teachers per student than adequately funded districts, lower average teacher salaries, fewer support staff per student. And so while I definitely believe that we need targeted investments in our teacher workforce, and we have to address the teacher workforce before we're going to be able to see student achievement rise, we are not going to just be able to create a teacher scholarship or something like that and resolve this issue, because we are going to continue to have the inequity where underfunded districts just will not be able to compete for staff. They won't be able to pay as much. They won't be able to improve their working conditions enough so that teachers will want to be there. So since teacher quality is really the most important in-school factor affecting student achievement, it's really critical to address funding inequities. And I don't believe, to Representative Isaacson's question earlier, that it's an either or, where we can't do some thinking specifically about how we're ensuring teacher quality and that is an educational input that's being prioritized with additional resources, but also recognizing that these districts would be raising their salaries if they could. They would be doing all of these things that we know attract high quality teachers if they could. That's the main cost that districts are spending money on. And it is just that they don't have the funds to attract more and higher quality teachers.
And then on page, I don't know what page this is in your testimony, where you talked about the goals of the Basic Ed Funding Commission.
Yes.
And your second goal was that the commission must include resources for pre-K, special ed, facilities, and transportation.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit about why those are so important to be included in our final plan?
Yes. So those are straight out of the court case, William Penn versus Pennsylvania. Judge Jubileer made clear in her ruling that low wealth districts are shortchanged in each of these areas, and that each of these are important in obtaining an adequate and equitable education. So for example, she discussed in her decision, I think there's about 40, 50 references to pre-K, and she talked about the credibility of research on the correlation between pre-K and future life outcomes and the connection between our early childhood system and our K-12 system. And also about the fact that lower wealth districts are unable to offer pre-K at the same rates. And so it's really important that these factors, although they are not ones that we've traditionally considered as part of BEF, that they be considered as part of the remedy to this court case, because it was clear that Judge Jubileer considered those important. I would note, as David mentioned, with facilities, it's just going to be trickier because we don't really have the data. With pre-K, we have a good sense. It's probably about $1 billion more for us to expand access to pre-K to all students who are eligible. We know that we currently have eligibility standards, but not access for all those students. With facilities, it's probably going to be a bit more of a process to figure out even what we need in order to close those gaps. But it's essential that that we make that a part of our goal.
And there's an educator shortage problem in the pre-K access as well.
Absolutely, and we pay our early childhood educators atrociously.
Yes, we do.
Yes,
Yes, we do.
We absolutely need to be thinking about how we address some of those labor market factors there too.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, one last question. In our prior hearings, there has been pushback about, the expert testimony that was provided on the estimate of closing the adequacy gaps, and questions based on some dollar amounts that we've put in under the last couple budget cycles.
Yes.
Like when enough will be enough was a question that was asked. Can you respond to those concerns about the dollar amount?
Yes. So I know that those concerns have been raised about when will enough be enough, the cost is too much, why hasn't student achievement improved if we've been putting more money in the past few years. I really just want to emphasize that this system has been created over decades, and a few years of increases is not going to solve the problem overnight. Even with recent increases, the hearings that have been held so far in Allentown, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and here today, each of those cities have per student shortfalls of between $4,600 and $10,000 per student. So the last few years have been like a Band-Aid. So it's sort of like giving someone with a gunshot wound a Band-Aid and then saying, why are you still bleeding? Like somebody who was starving, you give them a few good meals and you're like, why are you still skinny? We need to really systemically fix the problem, and it's going to take systemic solutions, and we have been, I think the legislature has been moving in the right direction the past few years, but this is our opportunity to more systemically reform it. Thanks.
Thank you. Senator Phillips-Hill?
Thank you very much. I want to get back to the line of questioning that Senator Rothman began. Although, Ms. Morales, I have a lot of things to share with you about why school lunches don't taste good anymore, and that's actually an issue regardless of which of the 500 public school districts your child attends, because that came down to us from the feds. But we're not tasked with grappling that, but I do have thoughts. So, looking at Lancaster's numbers, we talked about Lancaster City doing those numbers, doing some math. Lancaster City schools are getting 223% more aid than Manheim Township, which, by the way, Manheim Township is the lowest funded school district in Lancaster County. And then looking at your enrollment numbers since 2016-2017 school year, the school district of Lancaster has lost 1,285 students. It's a big number, right? That's almost the size of an entire school in many school districts. So with that significant decline in population, as a result of that, is the City of Lancaster Public Schools now benefiting from the hold harmless provision?
As you know, the hold harmless provision really locks in the funding based on those 1990 enrollment numbers. So again, from the standpoint of who's getting sort of more than their quote unquote fair share, any district that has declining enrollment is considered getting more than their fair share, while any district that's growing would be considered getting more than their fair share of the overall pie, which is too small. And so I think
we just took testimony from the first panel that said that we get an A for the amount of funding, we get an F for the way we distribute the funding, and heard testimony here today that it's really not about the amount of money, it's how we distribute the money. So what you're
I think
saying
there's
is
a little
contrary
bit,
to what the first panel testified.
I'm not
to
sure
us
that David
today.
and Marc would go quite that far. I think we do see that Pennsylvania is relatively high spending. When you look at us compared to our neighboring states to the Northeast, we're not necessarily as comparatively high spending, and you do have to take into account the labor market here, which is just more competitive than it is in other parts of the country.
More competitive than New York, more competitive than New Jersey?
Well, we're lower spending than those states, but more competitive than Mississippi or Alabama or some of the other states to which we're considered high spending compared to. And so the idea of, are these districts getting more or less than their fair share because of declining enrollment? The idea of adequacy targets is that you're starting from scratch. You're starting on a clean foot based on need. You're taking into account what are the current enrollment numbers, what is the spending of high-performing districts, and then you're adjusting those enrollment numbers with weights based on student need. And so though that analysis tells us that today, even with declining enrollment, even with any of those other changes, that the City of Lancaster and many of these other districts, about 85% of districts across the Commonwealth, are underfunded compared to their adequacy targets that take into account student need.
Yeah, we're grappling with that, right? Because we looked at those numbers as well, and the senator from Cumberland County said his most popular district that does so much for so many students, that now the trouble is they've got too many kids moving in because of the exceptional education that they receive there. According to that data that you're quoting, they're underfunded as well. So I guess that points to the fact that we have a lot more work
It's
to
certainly
do and
complex,
a lot more testimony to take and numbers to work through. So
I would just
appreciate
encourage you
that
not
response.
to let that complexity stop you from doing what we know is right. I think we all agree at this point that we have huge inequities in how we're funding our system, and we need to figure out ways to close those. And while we might, quibble about the exact weights or the exact analysis, I think we have a clear direction that we need to go in order to create a more equitable system for our students.
And I think I understand what you are getting toward, but I think that we have to be precise. We have to take the data into consideration. We have to do the right thing, because what we have seen in the past is that we could inadvertently harm as well. So that's not someplace that we as a commission would want to go. I certainly don't want to see us go down that path. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Laura, I hope you do have your sneakers on today? Okay.
I got
all right.
comfortable shoes. I didn't wear
Very
heels.
good. Okay. All right. I wish I wore mine. I'm sorry, but you know. We were reminded what you were either watched or were in attendance in the Philadelphia conversation, and all agreed, I think, in a bipartisan fashion, that the last panel was probably the most
Yes.
impactful panel. No disrespect to any of the other panelists beforehand. All right. Ms. Cooper from Children First reminded us of something that I apologize to the commission that had slipped my mind, and I think it was referred to earlier today, that we have a demonstrated history, not too far, not too distant history, but in a significant portion of the Rendell administration, when there was a dramatic increase in education funding,
Yes.
in agreed state education funding,
Yes.
in an agreed to, in a series of agreed to investments, that test scores rose in every subject matter for every school district all across Pennsylvania.
That's correct.
We seem to have forgotten that demonstration of real-time history. Agreed to investments in things that educators have researched, will make an impact if we make these investments. Every grade level, every subject matter, all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, test scores raised.
That's correct.
Increased.
Yeah. Test scores rose across the board, but also importantly, they rose the most for our underserved students, our Black students, our Hispanic students, and our free and reduced price lunch students. Those are the ones they rose the most for, and there we saw the narrowing of achievement gaps.
And when the Commonwealth abandoned those increases, the test scores did not rise.
We saw a decade's worth of gains erased very quickly.
Very
Yes.
quickly. All right. Want to raise up this name. His name is Chris Trakamas. You may remember the incident with Chris.
Yes.
Chris was a building engineer at the Edmonds School, for the members of the panel, who died when a boiler exploded at the Edmonds School in Philadelphia from third-degree burns because the boiler exploded.
Yeah.
All right. We should also always be mindful of not just the statistics and the numbers, but the human tragedy that occurs
Yeah.
when neglect is present. The study that the Penn State professor provided us, the research and the numbers, does not include school infrastructure.
That's correct.
Any thoughts on that?
we know that school infrastructure is critical to address. We just don't have the data to estimate exactly the cost right now. But, you know, as a former teacher in Philadelphia, I can't emphasize enough, it's not just the fact that we know that, you know, facilities impact learning, and obviously it's harder to learn when your classroom is 96 degrees and all of that. It's also the message that we're sending to kids about how much their education is valued and how much we care about their future. And so, you know, I often hear, particularly when I was teaching in Philly, people would talk about, you know, why don't these kids value their education and look at the crime rates and, you know, what's going on, why are kids acting this way, or why are test scores so low? When you come to school every day in a building that is crumbling, that is, you know, in some cases literally poisoning you, that does something to you. It tells you something about how you are valued, and some of those dreams that you have for yourself, you start to feel either they're not possible or I can't get them here. So why am I putting my energy and my effort? And so we've been talking to Pennsylvania students, parents. Some students in our underfunded districts, they've already, in some cases, kind of given up on their opportunities to get equal educational opportunities. They're talking about, I want my younger siblings to at least have more opportunities than I have. I want my kids to have more opportunities than I have. They can see it. Our kids are smart, and they understand the messages that we're sending them with these crumbling facilities and this infrastructure, and all of these other unequal inputs. And so it's critically important, not only just because it directly impacts learning, but it's just such a tangible symbol of how much we do or don't value our kids' education.
I know there are members of this panel who get grumpy when they don't get the right coffee in the morning, all right?
Yep.
Okay, all right?
Me too.
I didn't, now, see, you're telling on yourself, okay? You're telling on yourself. When they didn't get the right coffee, all right? But it is, when a classroom is 95 degrees, but let's make it more real, okay? Let's make it more real. When there's lead inside a school building,
right,
and it has been determined as early as the early 1970s that lead is poisonous and disrupts your capacity to think.
Yes.
All right? Yet alone, the overwhelming majority of our school buildings built prior to 1974, 1975. So consequently, if they're crumbling, it's not just a conversation of asbestos. It's not just a conversation of heating and cooling. The poison of lead resides in far too many school buildings and then consequently likely has an impact. Yet we don't test, are not mandated to test at the level we should be.
That's correct.
All right, for lead. And we allow our school buildings where our precious children are required to be, we allow them to continue to exist, and their teachers and other. Should this commission be thinking about and researching the issues around school infrastructure as well?
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember, and I think that this came up on the first panel as well, we absolutely should be thinking about what we know about the evidence-based inputs and the requirements and whether there needs to be, you know, accountability around the money. We just have to provide the resources as well. For us to say, okay, everybody needs to do lead testing now, and if you find lead, you have to fix it. If we aren't giving these underfunded districts the resources alongside that, then we're just, again, sort of passing on an unfunded mandate that is going to give us another indicator that they're failing. So it's important to also be giving them the resources to be able to address those things. But with lead, you know, we know that it has an impact on IQ. I think there's good research that shows that when we started to sort of crack down on lead in gasoline and so forth, we saw crime rates decrease. You know, there's a direct line between exposure to lead and all kinds of terrible life outcomes. So absolutely, we should be addressing that.
Thank you, Mr.
Representative Schweier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Laura, we're going to come back to you. You take a break. You sit there for a second if you'd be so kind, but I am going to ask you to come up in just a second. Ms. Morales, do you have a second? Can you join us first for a moment? Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to expound upon something that you'd mentioned in your testimony, that that there's a difference in educating children, I believe you said from Puerto Rico versus refugees from Congo, I think you said. I think that's lost on a lot of the people. Representing a school district that has 51 nations of origin, 26 languages spoken, last numbers I heard. We have a growing population from not only Liberia, Kenya, Haiti, Central and South American nations, but we now have an exploding Polish population in Allentown, coming from borderlands of Ukraine, or border areas of Ukraine that are now moving to Allentown, all of whom bring very, very unique and very different traumas to the table. So from your experience in a similar school district, can you tell us just from a practical real life standing perspective, how those different children are learning, what they're bringing with them, and why is it, again, in a school district that was one of the ones that successfully sued the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, what you see every day from a real life perspective and how those resources would matter to you?
So, yeah, you have your students coming, and many of them don't speak English. So there's one layer, right? The thing is, what research has shown that a student who is educated in their home country, who is literate in their home language, learns English faster, learns English a little more easily. I'm thinking of a student, when I said Guatemala, I was thinking of
Guatemala, I'm sorry. Thank
yeah,
you.
I was thinking of a student last year at Reynolds, a really delightful young lady, 7th grader. I believe she went to 2nd grade in Guatemala, and then that was pretty much it. And then her whole family came here. Spanish was her second language. They actually were Quechua speakers. So I don't believe that's a written language. So there, we already had a barrier. I mean, this girl, I watched her in a all 7th grade meeting look around and figure out how to follow people where to go. But, you know, trying to get her to learn along with everyone else was very difficult. I went into her social studies class and helped the social studies teacher, but we had to modify like crazy. And even communicating with a family, luckily there were volunteers who came to conferences and things that interpreted, but that's another level, you know, of getting things home. We have to have funds to provide interpreters, funds to provide translated documents, because there was a Supreme Court case, and I can't remember what it was, that things have to go home in a language the family understands. Then you have our refugee population, which I believe was alluded to, that Lancaster County, Representative Sterling, you said, Lancaster County relocates way more refugees than the rest of the country, basically. The BBC called us the refugee city a few years ago, which is a matter of pride to me because I worked with a lot of those students. But
sure, absolutely.
I've had students who left their home country under heavy shelling and had severe emotional trauma. Sometimes they couldn't go to school. They'd be walking to school with their parents, and they would have to turn home. We had students who's had family members left behind. They were here. We've had students that were here by themselves, living with other relatives because they're you know, maybe with an aunt or an uncle or a kind friend. And those students have all that trauma. We had a girl came in as a 6th grader, and she was not okay. She bullied other kids. She cut herself. She did all these things, and we managed to get her some counseling in the school. And by the 8th grade, she was smiling, and she had friends. But there was all that other stuff that had to happen for her. Refugees are ones that really, we think of them, oh, they're refugees, but you don't know. Some of my refugee students grew up in concentration camps. They were born there. Some simply lived in another country, in a city. I had a Sudanese family that they lived in Egypt before they came here. So yeah, they were refugees, but they hadn't experienced directly the conflict. So you have to get to know your students, and that takes time for the teacher. That takes different resources, interpreters, people coming in. We had the refugee center at Reynolds. That was a godsend because there were people there that could come and help. You know, there are just so many layers with that population that you can't just say, oh, they're an English learner, and that's enough. If they all came like our Nepali kids from about 15 years ago, that's great. They all had a basic level of education and rapidly learned English and rapidly were able to assimilate in, but others do not.
I really appreciate that because, you know, candidly, the Commonwealth for years has, through our own policies that we've enacted, acknowledged the fact that kids are different. We have an entire separate fund for students with special needs. That's the most basic and obvious way that we all acknowledge that kids are different. The current basic education formula that we have acknowledges that, with 3 different levels of poverty baked into the formula, English as second language learners baked into that formula. We already acknowledge that kids learn differently, and I think it's an important. I'm a little surprised that we have to go down this road, but we're going down this road because there is a fundamental, even though we've all through our votes acknowledged that this is the case, I think there are people that are still sort of struggling to internalize the fact that kids are so dramatically different. And also just the fundamental problem that many of us have, and frankly it took me years to sort of really truly understand, that the challenges for children who weren't born in the United States are so vastly different amongst themselves that it's not just, we just got to teach them English is not nearly enough. Yes, that's part of it. That's not nearly enough. So I really appreciate that. So thank you. I'm going to ask Pastor Edwards if he could come up, sir. Now, full disclosure, Greg and I are friends. We have worked together in a number of different ways. What I'm not going to do, sir, is have our private conversations out here.
That's good.
Because we've had some private conversations through the years.
Yes.
However, one of the things you touched upon in your testimony was the pre-K, the early childhood work that Resurrected Life Community, the Community Development Center does. Can you expound on the types of kids that you're seeing there and the struggles that they go through on a regular basis?
Sure. So our congregation has a separate sibling organization. It's non-parochial. It's not faith-based. It's a 501c3, and we have 2 early learning centers that are certified by the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services, and they are Star 4. So we are at the top of the rung in terms of the quality of care we provide. So where we provide services are in the 18 and 20 census tracts, which has the highest concentration of poverty in the entire Lehigh Valley. So the per capita is below $20,000 per person. And what we found in that area when we got to that location that we specifically wanted to be in, by the way, because we figured if we can do it there in Allentown, we could do it anywhere, was that 95% of the children in that catchment area were not graduating 3rd grade on a 3rd grade reading level. And so we decided to put a mark in the ground and really significantly invest in the first 4 years of an individual's life, because we know the first 4 years of a person's life is the absolute most critical. And at the time that we provided the services, I believe kindergarten was not a requirement in Pennsylvania. So we saw 7- and 8-year-olds going to 1st and 2nd grade who did not have the social or emotional ability to really be attentive in a classroom in order to learn. And then we actually saw a trajectory of those children being funneled into special education. So our parents are working 2 and 3 jobs. Most of them are taking 3 or 4 buses to be employed by the hospitality industry, warehouse, or some type of domestic service at one of the local hotel chains. So by the time they drop their children off to us, and we provide care for infants, toddlers, preschoolers, then we do before and after school programming for moms and dads that have to be at work at 7, but their child goes to school at 8. That the last time their child got a meal was when they were with us, right? Or when they were in school. By the time they drop the child off to us, they've already had a full day, right? Of having to care for 3 and 4 kids. Sometimes when they come there, we notice that the families are wearing the same clothes. And that's been more than a handful of situations. And so not only do we provide childcare services, but we provide care for the entire family, right? So resume writing, home ownership, credit repair. When we're talking about addressing the well-being of a child, that child is a part of an ecosystem, and you can't divorce that child from their family or what's happening in the home. And so we provide a lot of wraparound services related to food, health, shelter, and well-being. But they go through a lot, and we see that shows up when we look at who turns out for the local elections, right? So we have a city that's 130,000. We've got 60% of the city that is registered to vote, and we have a less than 7%, I think, turnout. So
Numbers, yeah.
give or take,
Yeah.
right? And then what we do is we say, well, you don't care about politics or you don't care about democracy because you don't vote. Well, that's not fair, right? We don't understand that many of our families and children have been placed in structures where they are made every day to be invisible and disposable. And that often happens when a student comes into a building and they're not even greeted with a smile, right? And there's a lot of things happening within the culture of that building. And I'm not talking about racially, but in some of our schools, as you are well aware of, they were built during the Civil War.
Right.
They don't have toilets that flush, exposed electrical wire hanging from the janitor's closet, lead paint, we talked about asbestos,
Right.
and yet we hold them to the same standards of what it means to be productive and successful when they graduate.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Those families, similar to my conversation with Ms. Morales, those families that you serve that are taking multiple buses to go out to the Amazon warehouse or wherever
Sure.
they're at, their life is obviously more challenging than, on the whole, than the folks in neighboring districts, right?
Sure.
Okay. So once again, children need different things.
Absolutely.
Different communities based on need and wealth.
Right.
That matters, and that explains the difference between school districts as a geographic boundary of these things.
So in my doctorate degree is in critical pedagogy as a mechanism to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. So, and what we see is the necessity in educational environments from the earliest years of life around what we call individualization. Every child's an individual. And I think part of what's happening perhaps in some of the conversation is there's a distinct difference between equality and equity. And I think some folks may not have a working definition, with all due respect, of equity means that not everybody's going to get the same thing. And that may mean that someone says that's unfair. But there are some folks that need something different in order for there to be a level playing field.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'm going to ask Laura, now that you had your 3-minute break, if you'd be so kind.
My feet up.
So I wanted to have those conversations, and I wanted to get those conversations on record. Because getting back to our job of tinkering with, adjusting, funding, whatever it is that the commission ultimately comes up with on the Basic Education Funding Commission. What I believe Dr. Kelly, I believe the other previous testifiers today, and I believe you are all saying the same thing. It starts with a fundamental understanding that not all kids are exactly the same.
Yes, which again, this General Assembly has also acknowledged in the weights in the current formula, in the Level Up program that specifically acknowledges student need and accelerates funds to those underfunded districts, absolutely.
Okay. And so the very premise and the way that, and I understand that Dr. Kelly's not testifying today, but my understanding, and please tell me if you disagree, the way that he got to that number was saying taking some outliers out, those high achieving districts, this is how much they spend per child, and then what we do is we acknowledge those differences in children based on school districts, and we get them as close to that number as realistically possible, roughly.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to give you some made-up numbers just to try and make it concrete. And
Yeah, well,
apologies to
just
Dr.
for
Kelly
illustration,
if I
yeah.
said it, say anything incorrectly. But let's say that the high-performing districts, on average, when you look at their per student funding, they're spending $15,000 a student. Then you look at another district and you take a student who has an IEP, who's an English language learner, and who qualifies for free and reduced price lunch. And you say, okay, let me look at the weights within the regular basic education and special education formulas that might tell me that that student needs to be weighted at double the cost, because that's what the research tells us is the resources that they need for, you know, the pull-out services that they might need for their IEP, and the additional tutoring that they need as an English language learner, or the work with a specialist for those reasons. And so then you would use that weighted student count to then multiply that by the per student adequacy or sort of per student funding rate from those successful schools. And that's how you're getting to these numbers.
Okay. And the part, and the next part as to why we get to that number. And this is something that there's been very good and very honest conversation from members. I think, I want to be clear, I think all the members of the commission are trying to internalize an understanding, and myself included, this very, very dense policy issues that has that impacts the real lives of the kids that were literally just playing on the other side of this wall. And we get to that $6.2 billion number in addition to legacy costs like pensions and those sorts of things by elevating those districts that have the most amount of needs. Instead of taking all the money that we spend right now, which of course includes local property taxes, that is vastly different amongst communities, and leveling that out. If we effectively were to do something like that, what we're really doing is going to be taking money away from many, many districts and pulling it over. So I think what Dr. Kelly and yourself and the testifiers that we were saying is ultimately we get to that number first by acknowledging that students are different. Second, by acknowledging that every student needs at least a baseline amount of support. And the way to get there is not by taking away from those students that have more, but it's by elevating those that have less and need more supports.
Yes, and that, I mean, the reason, if you think about why is Pennsylvania earning an F in terms of funding equity, why are we, you know, consistently getting these very inequitable outcomes, it connects to the fact that our overall share of funding is primarily coming from local districts and not from the state. And that, I mean, that those two things are connected because we're getting more funding from local property wealth that's inherently inequitable. And so the idea is you're increasing state funding and you're targeting that state funding in a way that is helping to close those gaps, while recognizing that the local, we are not, there's not going to be a way that I know of that's going to close those local wealth gaps. That is just baked into our, you know, highly economically segregated society. But the purpose of the state funding is going to help to bring up to adequacy those districts that don't have the local property tax base, even if they're trying really hard like Allentown and taxing themselves at higher rates than some of these wealthier districts. They just can't raise the revenue because they don't have the wealth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I don't have a question, but I do want to make a comment because we've talked a little bit about the fact that we had shown success back during the couple of the Rendell years where we were putting more money in and we had specific targeted programs, and there was a Representative Smith, who became Speaker of the House, had accountability block grants, and we were putting money in with specific targets of what we wanted to get accomplished, and we got results. And then came the cuts of, when was it, 2010 or whenever, and without assigning blame to anyone, because part of it was that we had one-time funds that we ran out of, part of it was we were hit by a recession. Whatever the reason, we cut $1 billion from education. The point I want to make is that those cuts were done in perhaps the most inequitable way possible, because we basically said everybody's going to get a 10% haircut. Now, what we had was a system that said, gee, the districts that are wealthy and doing fine, they get 10% of their funds from the state and 90% of their funds come from local taxes. The poor districts, they're getting 30% of their funds from local taxes and 70% of their funds from the state. We didn't cut everybody We didn't say the district that's getting 10% gets all 10% of their money gone. We said they get a 10% cut. So they got 10% cut of the 10% of their money. So their total funding in that district went down 1%. The district that was getting 70% didn't get cut. They got cut 10% of their 60%. So they got a 6% cut or a 7% cut or an 8% cut. And so the districts that needed the dollars the most were cut the most. And the districts that needed the state dollars the least were cut the least. And so we took everything that we had done in terms of gains in inequities prior to that and wiped it out. And we are just now in 2023 at a point where some districts are back to the levels that they were in terms of state funding or state share of funding in 2010. And so despite all the money we dumped in the last couple of years, it was to basically backfill the cuts that we had made, because the cuts weren't made equally across the board. They were made as a percentage of an inequitable system already. And so, and I don't know what the lowest percentage is of schools that's, and maybe this is a question, if somebody can tell me this, some schools get a small percentage of state funding, and I don't know what what is the smallest percentage? Is it 10% or 12 or 9 or, and some districts get a pretty high percentage of state funding, and I don't know what that highest percentage is. But my guess is that if we actually expanded, like, hey, maybe instead of 10%, you get 2% or 1% of funding from the state. And maybe instead of 70%, you get 99% of your funding from the state, that we can start to close those gaps just because of the way we actually push that funding out. Is there any correction? Is that correct assumption? I'm seeing. Okay. All right. Yeah, so that's yes. So we're only on schedule to run about an hour behind again today. So with that, we're going to swear in panel 3, Dr. Miles and Matt Przywara. Dr. Miles is Superintendent of the School District of Lancaster, and Matt Przywara is Assistant Superintendent of the School District of Lancaster and the former business manager. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And if so, indicate by saying I do. I do. Okay, Dr. Miles, you're on. And I will point out Dr. Miles has some experience in the New Jersey system that was kind of court order to do some things too, so.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, commission members. A big kudos to Chair Sturla and Phillips-Hill for their leadership around this important topic. The School District of Lancaster is pleased to host today's hearings. Before I jump into my prepared comments, I would like to give you all a taste of what to expect if we were to step outside of this space and visit one of our incredibly diverse classrooms across the district. So imagine you're standing in front of your students. This is what you can expect. 4 of your students do not speak English as their native language. Of these, 2 are recent immigrants, one of whom is a refugee. The refugee student has significant trauma, and his parents will not let him ride the bus because for him, buses take you to places you don't want to go. 4 of your students qualify for special education services. 17 of your students are economically disadvantaged. 1 of your students does not have a place to live. At the end of the school year, these students are expected to meet the same standards as their grade level peers in English and math. As their teacher, you are responsible. As a result of the factors I mentioned above, 5 of your students are far behind their grade level in English language arts. 11 are far behind in math, 9 in ELA, 6 in math, a little behind. You need to catch these students up, but 6 students are on grade level or advanced. They can't be allowed to fall behind. Can you pull this off? Here's what you need to be successful. You need specially trained teachers who can work individually and in small groups with the students who do not speak English. To accelerate their language acquisition, English is essential to accessing the curriculum. You need cultural navigators to assist the immigrant and refugee families in understanding the U.S. system and acclimating to life in the U.S. You need specifically trained or specially trained teachers to provide special education services to the qualifying students. Depending on their needs, it may take more than one. And these special education teachers need aides to assist in the classroom as required by law. Because you need to teach the curriculum for your grade level, you need help catching up to students who are behind. For some, you can work with a classroom aide to run small groups. For others, you need specialized teachers to work with them individually in what we call an academic intervention. You need social workers, counselors, and therapists available to support families living on low incomes, especially those facing housing insecurity. And now to my prepared testimony. First, let me acknowledge two facts, supported by research and affirmed by basic education funding formulas. School districts enrolling more children of low-income families and English language learners they need more resources to equalize and stabilize their education. Yet these are the same districts that are at a disadvantage in terms of raising revenues. In the school district of Lancaster, 90% of our students come from economically disadvantaged families. 1 in 5 of our students speaks a language other than English, which is more than 7 times as many as the average of the other districts in our county. As a district, we are committed to closing achievement gaps, for we believe that every child deserves an excellent education. As we recognize the cycle of poverty perpetuated by inadequate education creates a financial burden on taxpayers that grows over time. As I shared with the House Education Commission in Harrisburg, our district spends $6.5 million on early childhood to close school readiness gaps, $3 million on extended day, after school and summer programs to close learning gaps, $3 million on social workers and community schools to support our students and families who are under-resourced, and nearly $3 million on college and career supports, including school-to-work programs and college counseling, not including our regular counseling to close post-secondary gaps. We spend $11.5 million annually on our programs for English language learners, larger than the entire basic education funding subsidy for 2/3 of our neighboring school districts in Lancaster County. These investments, which together total more than $20 million, are essential in high demand and in some cases insufficient. Thanks to recent increases in funding, we were able to add a para-educator to every kindergarten classroom in our district. These aides work closely with students to ensure they're acquiring the necessary foundational skills to succeed in school. For example, our kindergartners with the most gaps and challenges check in with these para-educators 3 times a day as part of meeting their social-emotional learning gaps and goals. The para-educator makes it possible for the same students to participate in small groups throughout the day. A good number of these students have moved multiple grade levels in 1 year. The hard reality is, without this funding, students new to our country, students suffering from trauma, students multiple years behind in literacy would not continue to make this type of progress. We also added academic interventionists at the elementary level. These educators work individually and in small groups with students in grades K to 2 who need additional help in math and language arts outside of the classroom. Our interventionists can share countless stories of students who, after 8 weeks of intensive daily reading support, were able to return to the classroom reading with their peers. The fact is, we recognize a similar need for interventionists to work with our middle school students, specifically in math, where too many of our students are falling short of their targets, but we do not have the resources. The fact is, some of our facilities still lag behind after 15 years after we began our master construction plan. In fact, we've had to call 4 days of early dismissals for students at 3 of our schools during a recent heat wave because their schools did not have air conditioning or proper ventilation. Struggling students and students already behind academically lost important instructional time because the buildings are too uncomfortable for serious teaching and learning to occur. Our neighboring suburban districts did not face this challenge. Yet we have been chronically underfunded by tens of millions of dollars over the past decade, according to the legislature's own formula for school district need. That's why we were one of those 6 districts, 7 parents, the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, and the NAACP Pennsylvania State Conference to win a historic victory in Commonwealth Court when the judge ruled that Pennsylvania's school funding system is unconstitutional and harms schools districts with the most need. Most of the court's decision was based upon the Commonwealth's own laws and statistics. It relied on the Level Up formula, which combines both the fair funding and special education formulas definitions of need to determine which districts are spending the least in the state relative to those needs. I have a unique perspective, as Representative Sterler mentioned, because I've served in New Jersey as a principal, assistant superintendent, as well as superintendent. New Jersey offers a window into our future if we do not heed the court's call. In 1981, the Education Law Center filed a complaint in New Jersey Superior Court challenging New Jersey systems of financing public education. It represented 20 students attending low-income schools in the state. The case, which became known as Abbott versus Burke, ultimately reached the New Jersey Supreme Court. In 1990, the state Supreme Court found the state system of funding unconstitutional as applied to children in 31 poor urban school districts. I worked at 3 of what are now known as former Abbott districts, Camden, Trenton, as well as Bridgeton. In response to the ruling, the state legislature modestly increased aid levels for Abbott districts, but failed to provide parity. So in 1994, the Supreme Court ordered the legislature to assure substantial equivalence in funding within 2 years. Again, the court found the legislature's response insufficient. Ultimately, the court took it upon itself to direct a comprehensive set of remedial measures to ensure an adequate and equal education for low-income school children. By the mid-2000s, when funding to the Abbott districts was being scaled up, New Jersey saw its largest gains in student achievement for economically disadvantaged students. New Jersey serves as both a cautionary tale of what can happen if a legislature does not abide by the clear ruling of a court, but it also serves as an example of the transformative impact of adequate school funding. Finally, let me close with a plea for predictability. Crafting a school budget takes time. Responsible school budgeting does not happen overnight or even in 1 year. Strong institutions have multi-year plans that allow time for investments to show impact. Our current system is at odds with this time-tested approach. We begin our budget process without knowing our state funding for the upcoming year. School boards must approve their budgets before the legislature passes a state budget. So even when the state does provide necessary additional resources, the impact is delayed. I call on this commission and the legislature at large to study ways to provide school districts with a sustainable, long-term, and predictable plan for how it will adequately fund schools. Thank you.
Mr. Przywara?
Let me guess, you have lunch right after this? So it's just me. So,
Not the school lunch, though.
Yes.
no, we have school lunch for you. So as you stated at the beginning, you all have my written testimony. I'm going to abbreviate it a little bit so you can get into your Q&A. So thanks. I'm Matt Przywara. I'm the Assistant Superintendent here at the School District of Lancaster. And as Representative Sterler said, I served as the CFO for the last 16 years. I did 2 stints as acting superintendent, so I have a wide array of experience here at the School District of Lancaster. And prior to that, I actually worked at the Norristown Area School District a few years prior to that. So the concept of basic education funding is not just about dollars and cents. It's about investing in our most precious resources, as you've heard today, our children. Adequate funding is the lifeblood of an effective educational system. It enables schools to attract and retain talented educators, maintain up-to-date facilities, and provide students with the tools they need to succeed in an increasingly complex world. For the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the funding is not an expense, it's an investment in our future. But today I really want to illustrate our annual struggle with a structural deficit caused by expenses that rise faster than our tax base can keep pace, causing disproportionately high real estate taxes, which are exacerbated by the inadequate funding from the state. And you heard a lot of those examples from Dr. Miles, and this will give you some more evidence about why we have these structural deficits and why, when you don't keep pace, this happens. Our expenses continue to rise in the form of human capital resources. We are a service-driven organization that relies on the many talents of our educators and support staff in our schools. Our students are in need of far greater services than our neighboring peers, and that is why we need to invest more each year in our people and our programs here at the local level. We are a transparent and value-driven organization that is very mindful of any additional tax burden we place on our local community. We are outpaced on the amenities our close peers have, such as state-of-the-art facilities, instructional resources, and athletic fields, all of which are critical to an educational experience our students should expect to be prepared to compete for college and career opportunities. Our local tax revenue is largely static. Our district is landlocked, with a dwindling amount of space to add new development that would grow our tax base. At the same time, more than $250 million in property value in our district, 30% of all properties are tax exempt, including hospitals, colleges, churches, and economic development projects. Though we do receive voluntary payments from some of these owners, it is tens of millions of dollars less than the full property tax bills would be. The impact of all this, though, is a disproportionately high millage rate for our own homeowners that raises far less revenue than lower rates in more affluent communities. For example, in 21-22, the New Hope Salisbury School District on the New Jersey border near Doylestown, with just over 1,300 students, has a local tax rate that generates more than $30,141 in local revenue per student. When you add this to the district's basic ed funding per student of $990, they generate more than $31,000 in combined state and local revenue per student. Now, by comparison, in the school district of Lancaster, our tax rate only generates $9,600 per student from our local revenue. With the additional state funding, including what we're waiting on, the level up funding of $6,500 per student, we're only able to generate a combined total of $16,000 per student. The disparities in this example are one of many when comparing the funding for schools in our Commonwealth. As my colleague, Dr. Miles, noted earlier, nearly 90% of our students are economically disadvantaged. 1 in 5 students, or nearly 2,000, speak a language other than English. In New Hope School District, 10% of students are economically disadvantaged, and approximately 25 kids speak a language other than English. Only through predictable, consistent, and adequate funding mechanisms like BEF can we provide our students with the resources they need to access the education that they deserve. Adequate education funding in Lancaster means smaller class sizes, which allows for more individualized attention and better learning outcomes, especially coming post-pandemic. It means well-equipped classrooms with the latest technology and resources like our peers, so our students can prepare for a future where technology is integral. It means extracurricular programs that nurture talents and interests outside of the classroom, creating well-rounded individuals ready to tackle the challenges of tomorrow. And it means state-of-the-art facilities where students, staff, and community can come together to be their very best, while not having to combat factors such as unregulated temperatures in classrooms, failing electrical systems, and teaching our students with the most learning needs in closets, hallways, detached trailers, and the like. However, the impact of adequate funding goes beyond the immediate benefits. To me, it's an investment in the entire community. A well-educated workforce attracts businesses, stimulates economic growth, and ultimately strengthens the fabric of society. It reduces crime rates and reliance on social services, leading to a more prosperous and stable community for everyone, and ultimately a more stable Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The struggle for adequate funding is ongoing and requires the collective effort of citizens, policymakers, and educators. So thank you all for coming here today to do that. It's about making education a priority, not just in words, but in but in actions and budget allocations. As we start here our budget presentations every year in the school district of Lancaster, we start with one slide. Our budget is an expression of our values. It's time for the Commonwealth to express its collective values and invest in education by making a meaningful and concerted effort to move this process forward. It's about recognizing that the future of our state and our nation depends on the quality of education we provide today. And I'll just close there in summary.
Thank you. Question? Representative Topper.
Thank you.
And Dr. Miles, can you come up also?
Mr. Przywara, how did
Yes,
I do
sir.
with that, by the way? Was that
You did a great job.
Okay, all right.
Can you do it in Polish?
I spoke quickly enough to maybe cover it up if I screwed
If
up.
you can do it in Polish, then you get an extra star.
So you've obviously crunched numbers for quite some time. You know that we run the new money, any new money, through the new part of the formula, which is a hybrid of what we've added since I've been in the legislature and then what was there before. If we were to take away the old formula and just run everything, old dollars, new dollars, everything through the new formula, would that work?
No, I still don't think that's sufficient. A lot of folks, testified today about those adequacy targets. And I think one of the challenges, one of the folks up here brought it up, for us that we need to make up for over time is that lost enrollment. So that's one of the things that's going to take some time to, what you don't want to do is rip money away from school districts very quickly. There needs to be a process of time where if there is lost enrollment or changes in programs or changes in demographics, that school districts can, as Dr. Miles noted, can plan for that. So it's very important that we have time and adequate time to plan.
Because the base of the formula is ADM, right? Our average daily membership kind of provides the base, and then we move on from that. One thing that you've experienced in Lancaster is very similar to what a lot of school districts that I represent in rural Appalachia, which is that declining student population. You know, at what point does a school graduating 12 students, like, I mean, how much more of a road do we need to give them to realize we don't have the tax base anymore? You simply don't have. So that calculation, which of course is encapsulated and hold harmless, has to be adjusted, in my opinion, in some way. And I'm talking about, by the way, school districts that I represent. Right. So, you know, we can all talk about political courage, you know. Agreed. I'm talking about school districts that I represent that receive 81% of their funding through the state. So I'm knowledgeable of what we're talking, and all have free and reduced lunch, you know. So, but there's also the numbers equation of, at some point, there has to be a discussion of whether that is viable, or whether we talk about what would the formula look like if we were running money through, if it's not county, it could be regional, or it could be incentives to work with other districts, some kind of a part of the formula that acknowledges decreased student population. What could that look like in your opinion?
I don't know exactly what it looked like today. We need some more time to do that. I think that you can use elements. It was mentioned before. Governor Rendell, there was the costing out study. We have the formula, and we're talking about these adequacy targets now. I would agree with you, though. I think the commission should take into consideration those things as school districts are in declining enrollment and those changes are happening. You know, how do we handle that as a state instead of, and again, I'll quote what I said before, we don't want to go like 1 year and rip funds away. So that gets back to the hold harmless. There's pros and cons of the hold harmless. I think one of the pros is really allowing time for school districts to recoup from either lost enrollment, changes in the economics around their communities, whether they need to grow or consolidate or whatever that might be. But I think the commission should put a footnote in whatever report that is that takes that into consideration in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hughes.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate your testimony, appreciate your commitment. We talk about costs. I'm a revered Benjamin Franklin. I'm going to quote him. The only thing that is more expensive than education is ignorance. I'm sure we're all familiar with that, okay? So for generations, not just a few years, but for generations, there's been this disinvestment. There's been this unconstitutional, there's been this inadequate funding of public education, and now we're tasked, based on the president judge's order, to fix that. Generations, not just a few years, generations. So now we've got to fix it. And it wasn't a short court order, it was 786 pages of a court order. And it was so much so that folks who had the opportunity to appeal it chose not to. So this is it. This is the deal. This is what we got to do. Your educators, and I'm gonna first of all, Dr. Miles, this is your district. We're in your district. We commend you on the young lady practicing her saxophone outside. She clearly was channeling Charlie Parker or John Coltrane or something like that. But as an aficionado, I really appreciated it, okay? But the whole notion of a student sitting in the hallway practicing her saxophone is really, in many respects, what education is supposed to be all about, right? You know, if that's your thing, let's figure out a way to help you do your thing, okay? My thing is different than Representative Isaacson's thing or your thing or whatever, but let's figure out a way to do that. In that context, you may be familiar what was said, or the question that was asked in the court proceeding by the attorney on the other side. Why is a child, quote, was asked in open court, why is a child who's on the hamburger flipping track required to learn Algebra 1? Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I was there.
You were there? You were there?
Yeah, I testified. I testified.
You
in the court
testified.
case.
Were you asked it? Were you the one asked the question?
I wasn't asked me personally, but I was in the courtroom.
You
that
were in
day
the
it was
courtroom.
asked.
As educators, how did that make you feel?
I mean, we're here every day to ensure that we're educating our citizenry and raising the bar for our students so that they can graduate and pursue their dreams. So to me, that would be very offensive. We set the bar high, and we all reach for the stars. It's nothing, no disrespect to anybody who decides they want to be a cook, but making assumptions and coming at us with that type of question as a district, I would be offended. We have great students at McCaskey High School who are dually enrolled in college. We have an IB program all the way down to middle school. And so to make those assumptions about our district or to disparage our students in that way, as a leader, I would be offended, sir.
Okay. Matt, you were in the courtroom when this happened.
Yeah,
And I was not aware of that, so
Yep.
please.
No, that's okay. Definitely agree with Dr. Miles. I mean, everyone deserves a chance. Everyone has a different pathway in life, and your pathway can change multiple times. But to make those assumptions, I think is disrespectful of what we think of our youth here in the Commonwealth. And we need to give every opportunity for every student here they can be the greatest thing it can be. And as he quoted off all those different programs, here at the School District of Lancaster, it doesn't matter. We always say all roads lead to McCaskey. So whatever school you're coming from, at the end of the day, you're going to make it to our high school, and then you have multiple pathways in that high school, whether you want to do healthcare, you want to go on to college, you want to go on to the military, whatever that might be. We provide those pathways and that exploration for our students and help guide them through that so they can make the best possible choice and provide the rigor for them to get the best education they can.
The question, I raise it because the question seems to be consistent with how the formula is structured. It seems to be making assumptions, so therefore, why invest? Why invest? And that's what we're here to try to get rid of, okay? And give every opportunity. For older learners, and I've asked this at every hearing, and for the record, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chair, I did not pay Dr. Miles for every time he said the name Abbott, okay? I did not pay him. Some of you will know what I'm talking about, but I did not provide him any compensation for that. Okay, all right, okay. What responsibility do we have, or does the Commonwealth have, for overseeing an unconstitutional and inadequately funded education system for generations, for older learners, all right? For learners who have, at the very least, high school students who've been in an inadequately funded school for their entire academic career, let alone those who've graduated from these schools and have had to deal with this inadequacy of funding. What obligation do we have, or what does it cost to get them to where we need them to be? Or do we have an obligation?
We do. We do. Wherever we receive a student, whether it's one of our refugee students who just arrived to the country, or a student that's been in our system for, let's say, 10 years, and they get to 10th grade and they don't have what they need to be successful, our staff, they become experts at taking a student where they are, coaching the student on where they want to go and what they need to do to achieve their dreams and goals. That's our responsibility. If a student comes to us as a senior, it's our responsibility to take that senior, take into account their goals, aspirations, and to ensure their success and put them on the path to success.
But we have some state standards as well, right? So
Absolutely.
their goals, their aspirations match. We need to make sure we're matching the state standards to them as well, right? So we got to get them there, right? Matt, I don't know if you want to take a part of this.
I think that's,
All right.
I think what he said's good.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Phillips-Hill?
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. I'm going to stick with Matt because I'm not sure I can say your last name appropriately. And as someone who
They
has a
just
name
call
that
me
is
Matt P
constantly
around here.
butchered, I try to be
Yeah.
respectful. Just wanted to get back to financing. So as Senator Hughes referenced, we have a 786-page court decision that talked about not only how much money, but how we collected that money, how we distributed that money. Now, Lancaster is one of 2 cities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that has what's known as a CRISA City Revitalization and Improvement Zone. I think it was 2013 when that was enacted. You were the CFO of the district prior to being the assistant superintendent. And my understanding that special zone was really to encourage economic revitalization, development in a community the size of Lancaster. So from 2013 to present, did you see that improve the amount of local property tax, earned income tax that the district collected?
So from a real estate tax base, I mean, I'll just very simply, if you look at our trend line over the last 15 years, the real estate, it's a very slow beating heartbeat. Just goes up and down and up and down. Not what you would see in, in our neighboring districts where they create a new economic development project, such as the Belmont, that's just on the other side of our tax property, where you'd see their real estate tax graph go up significantly, and that comes with, for them, no students for the most part. In terms of the economic piece, we did see a slight, probably anywhere from maybe 5 to 6% increase in earned income tax revenue from that with new businesses. But that's a very, very, very small slice of the big pie
So
for us.
1%, 0.5%, right.
So we are seeing that, and you can definitely see the economic growth within our community here. And when I say community, within really in the city part, because we are the city and the township. But as I talked about in my testimony, static, because of all those different programs, which are good to incentivize folks to do economic growth and development here in the city, we don't reap those benefits. We won't reap, if any benefits, probably for the better part of 20 years once some of those programs come off those discounted ventures.
No, that's.
But we still have, just the last point is, but the challenge of that is we still have the needs of our students here that are outside of those development zones, living in low-income housing. And I'll just let you, if you're here in Lancaster today, after you go to the saloon with Thaddeus Stevens, go out to, just drive around through our community, and you'll get a good glimpse of everything we have here.
Well, and that's helpful to understand as we look at, we really are tasked with what's that formula. How do we fund public education is something that's on all of our minds. Wanting to switch more to an academic perspective, Dr. Miles, we understand what your trend line and your numbers has been with the decrease in population. That's been pretty significant. But when I was looking at your numbers here, one thing that I took away from the district was that we've seen an improvement in outcomes and a measurable outcome. And this commission's had a lot of conversation on how do we measure outcomes, how do we measure need, what are those factors. And again, as I said earlier, my predecessor loved to say, well, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And we know that you've had a lot of challenges. But you've improved your graduation rates. Now, I know you're fairly new in tenure here, so, but I'm sure they've passed on some of that knowledge to you. In 2011, your graduation rate was about 69%. In 2021, it was 78%. Through COVID, you have seen an increase in your graduation rates. So you've shown growth, and you've shown improvement in outcomes. So, look, I want that. I think we all want that in every district across the Commonwealth. So talk to us about how, obviously you haven't been here for that entire time, but your predecessors and you and the team here at Lancaster have improved those graduation rates and outcomes?
So, as you know, arriving, I've been on a listening tour, just wondering what's working. And so what has been working is small group interventions. This is why during COVID, we utilized some of our ESSER funds to purchase the additional paraprofessionals as well as the interventionists for our classrooms. We have better data systems that we've developed over time. So our staff, they're great at looking at a student. They're diverse students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, students from other countries, students that speak other languages. Our district is diverse in every way, even down to religion. But our teachers can look at that data. They can build relationships with students. They become better at meeting the needs of every child. We have a very strong student services department that has really stepped up during COVID. Our challenge is going to be maintaining the funding for all of those improvements that we've experienced so that we can keep the work moving forward. And so that's why this hearing is so important. The future of our district kind of hinges on our ability to maintain the levels of support that we've ramped up to meet the needs of all of our students.
Have you used one-time revenues for recurring expenses in this district?
One-time revenues for recurring expenses, I mean, we try not to do that because we know it cannot be promised. During COVID, we needed those extra adults and folks on hand to meet those needs that we didn't anticipate. And so we have, again, a paraprofessional in every kindergarten classroom. We have psychologists across our district. We do have extra staff that are on hand to provide counseling to students and some other unique positions that were added. And I would say, you know, that wouldn't have been possible without those one-time COVID grants that we've had.
But additionally, like back in the past, so one-time revenue, the easiest example is using elements or portions of our fund balance each and every year as those one-time pieces to balance our budget. So we actually do that every single year. But we do it very responsibly in balance with how much we're going to raise real estate taxes, and then we take that into account as we're monitoring the budget each and every year. So we're trying not to ever overspend and really hit our targets each year, so we have those reserves that we can balance each and every year, because without the predictability of funding or knowing what's going to come in, we then are left to plan on our own, and that's one way that we do that.
I appreciate that. Having been a school board director, I understand what you're saying. Making decisions in December when the budget isn't going to come through until June makes it really difficult, and thank you for your testimony today, gentlemen.
Thank you. Matt, I've got a question for you going back for the past 16 years. Look, I think this school district has done a yeoman's job in terms of doing more with less for seemingly forever. And my kids are products of this school district. I'm proud of that. I think the results were great. But I also know that there was a lot of times where things were lacking. The local effort that goes in here in terms of volunteers and the way you figured out how to take one grant and put it over here, and then the next year you grab another grant over here and replace it with that. And the tax effort, though, is astronomical. I mean, we are, like, if you talk to anybody, they're like, I don't care about my county taxes. My city taxes are a little high, but boy, my school district taxes, that is killing me. In the past 16 years while you've been here, has there been any year where we haven't raised school taxes?
No, we have not. And you can see that in every one of our budget presentations annually. We actually calculate it back to the start of Act 1 each year to show the community and the board where we've been. But no, there's not been a year. We've reduced it. We've been a little bit below our Act 1 index from time to time. But for the most part, we're taxing every year to keep up with our costs.
Okay, and that's just that's a reflection of what I believe is the case in almost every underfunded school district in the state of Pennsylvania. There is never the option of, hey, we're okay this year. It's, hey, we're okay this year if we raise taxes this much instead of this much. It's not a matter of if you're going to raise taxes, it's a matter of how much. And that has also a impact on the community in terms of will we ever get out from under it. And that's not a cut at the school board or the school district, because you're still, as I said, you know, juggling beyond comprehension. It's just the reality of, if we don't fund from the state, you're never going to get out from under it. You're just never going to get out from under it. And so I would implore our commission and members to look at that and give not only the school district the help it needs, but our citizens a little bit of relief at some point in time. And any other questions for? That's it. And look, we're right on time, well, 3 minutes over, an hour over, so that's, you know, that's right on time in my book. So, all right, thank you very much. With that, that concludes the hearing, and we are now in recess to the call of the chair. Thank you.